Review of The Making of Religion by B.B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Making of Religion by Andrew Lang, M.A., D.D.L., Honorary Fellow of Merton College, Oxford, sometime Gifford Lecturer in the University of St. Andrews, London, New York, and Bombay, Longmans, Green and Co., 1898, octavo, pages 6 to 380. In his dedicatory letter to Principal Donaldson, Mr. Lang intimates that these chapters on the early history of religions, quote, may be taken as representing the Gifford lectures, end quote, delivered by him, quote, though in fact, he adds, they contain very little that was spoken from Lord Gifford's chair, end quote. Unsystematic, diffuse, repetitious, desultory, quote, jotty, end quote, the whole discussion, nevertheless, not only is clothed with that piquant literary quality which Mr. Lang gives his writings, but is also of undeniable scientific importance. The object of the book is to discuss afresh the origin of the two fundamental beliefs which lie at the base of what we call religion, the belief in God and the belief in the immortality of the soul. If these beliefs arose, comments Mr. Lang, quote, in actual communion with deity, as the first at least did in the theory of the Hebrew Scriptures, or if they could be proved to arise in an unanalyzable sensus nominis, or even in a perception of the infinite, Max Müller, religion would have a divine, or at least a necessary source. To the theist, what is inevitable cannot but be divinely ordained, therefore religion is divinely preordained, therefore in essentials, though not in accidental details, religion is true. But if religion, as now understood among men, be the latest evolutionary form of a series of mistakes, fallacies, and illusions, if its germ be a blunder, and its present form only the result of progressive but unessential refinements on that blunder, the inference that religion is untrue, that nothing actual corresponds to its hypothesis, is very easily drawn. End quote, page 51. The latter view has attained among anthropologists almost the position of a fixed truth. The current teaching is briefly that man first derived the conception of spirit from the phenomena of sleep, dreams, shadow, trance, and hallucination, that his first worship was directed to the souls of his dead kindred and to spiritual existences fashioned on the same lines, and that, as the result of a variety of processes, these spirits prospered until they became gods, and at last one of them became supreme. Thus, quote, the ideas of God and of the soul are the result of early fallacious reasonings about misunderstood experiences, end quote, page 1. Even so, Mr. Lang is not prepared to acknowledge that religion may be lightly set aside as only a huge blunder. Quote, all our science itself is the result of progressive refinements upon hypotheses originally erroneous, fashioned to explain facts misconceived, end quote. Why may not our religion likewise, quote, even granting that it arose out of primitive fallacies and false hypotheses, end quote, have yet, quote, been refined, as science has been, through a multitude of causes into an approximate truth, end quote, page 51. But it seems more directly to the point to ask whether the current teaching is accordant with the facts. Mr. Lang thinks that it is not. And it is the object of this book to show that in two crucial points it is not, or, as he more coyly expresses it, that, quote, there are 2 points of view from which the evidence as to religion in its early stages has not been steadily contemplated, end quote, page 2. He proposes to reopen the matter at these 2 points and to raise anew the 2 questions, whether man arrived at belief in the existence of a soul solely through a misinterpretation of such simple phenomena as those of sleep and dreams, and whether man attained the conception of God through an evolution from the idea of spirit. To both questions he returns a negative reply, and it is the purpose of his book to validate these 2 negative replies. Mr. Lang justly points out that the 2 positions thus taken up by him are independent of each other. The establishment of them both would be, of course, the ruin of the presently dominant theory of the origin of religion, but the establishment of both is not essential for that result. It might well be that man arrived at the notion of spirit through a misinterpretation of the phenomena of dreams and the like, and yet if his idea of God is not a development of his doctrine of spirit, this fact would have no bearing on the validity of his doctrine of God. Mr. Lang unites the discussion of the two questions in this volume thus, not because they are essential to one another, but because he conceives that the developed idea of religion as prevalent among the higher races at present is a complex of the two ideas of the immortality of the soul and of the existence of an infinite moral ruler and judge. He is therefore at pains to investigate the origins of both ideas. His book thus falls into two very different portions. In the first, he seeks to bring forward indications that, quote, the savage theory of the soul may be based, at least in part, on experiences which cannot be made to fit into any purely materialistic system of the universe, end quote, page 2. In the second, he presents evidence which shows that the idea of God was not dependent on or derived from the idea of spirit, but was of wholly independent origin and was capable of a very high development apart from the aid of the idea of spirit, though of course this idea supplied a formula by which the mighty being already envisaged could be more adequately conceived, as well as an elevating conception of man's own nature. The importance of thus separating the idea of God from that of spirit is obvious, but we do not see why the idea of immortality also may not equally validly and with equal advantage be separated from that of spirit. Men believed in God, as Mr. Lang shows, without the aid of any metaphysical conception of spirit. Why might they not equally readily have believed in their own future existence apart from a conscious elaboration of a doctrine of spirit? It is also a question worth asking at this point, what does Mr. Lang mean by spirit? In this query we may indeed place our finger on a weak point in the book. Mr. Lang does not seem to keep clearly before him any consistent definition of this term, fundamental though it is to his whole argument. He seems to use it prevailingly as equivalent to ghost, and to conceive it merely negatively, as over against solid matter. Indeed, as we read his pages, we are reminded of the old scholastic pleasantry which replied to the query, "What is matter?" "Never mind," and to the query, "What is mind?" "No matter." But what spirit is, as distinguished from what it is not, Mr. Lang does not seem to stop to consider. If, however, spirit means positively nothing but thinking, feeling, willing, being, that is, if it is practically a synonym for person, then of course every person has the idea of spirit, undeveloped of course, given in the most immediate and intimate action of his self-consciousness, and the idea of a personal ruler is already the idea of a spiritual God, and as well the idea of the continued life of a person is already the idea of spiritual immortality. The metaphysical development of this conception is, to be sure, a different matter. We are, meanwhile, confused, and we think Mr. Lang confuses himself by his undefined usage of the term. We think, had he clearly discriminated the differing connotations of the word, he would have argued that the idea of spirit, ghost, was no more necessary to the belief in immortality than it is to the belief in God, and would have sought and found evidence of early belief in continued life and in future rewards and punishments, either before or certainly apart from the emergence in thought of any developed metaphysics of spirit. Certainly, at all events, such a state of mind is not uncommon today. The whole first section of Mr. Lang's book thus appears to us unnecessary to his avowed purpose. It is not required to show that men arrived at the conception of spirit by a valid pathway in order to obtain a valid starting point for belief in immortality. In the order of developing thought, the idea of immortality would rather precede that of spirit in this sense. Men would naturally believe in their own future existence before they fully wrought out a theory of the mode of that existence. Nevertheless, we are grateful for the chapters which investigate the possible and the actual grounds on which savage men may have come to the conviction of the existence of a something in man different from his bodily organism, which they could speak of as, quote, that in men which makes them live, end quote, and which they pictured as subject of experiences beyond the confines of the merely bodily life. The professed purpose of these chapters is to offer evidence that the inference drawn by primitive man that he possessed a soul did not necessarily rest on phenomena which readily admit of a materialistic explanation. Mr. Lang marshals an array of supernormal experiences asserted to occur among savage races, on the basis of which such an inference would not seem so absurd as it is commonly represented. He then parallels these asserted supernormal experiences with similar ones, occurring not among savages but among the cultured races of the modern world, and subject to the investigation of trained scientific intellects, with the effect of raising the question whether they are to rank merely among asserted experiences, or must not rather be believed to have actually occurred. Quote, "If so," he observes, "the savage philosophy and its supposed survivals in belief will appear in a new light," end quote, and it may at least be wise, quote, "to suspend our judgment not only as to the origin of the savage theory of spirits, but as to the materialistic hypothesis of the absence of a psychical element in man," end quote, page 71. The discussion of these points leads Mr. Lang into a very obscure region, into the region of hypnoticism, clairvoyance, crystal gazing, hallucinations, prophetic dreams, and the like. It is too much of a jungle for unwanted feet to tread, but we think he fairly makes out his point, that there are supernatural experiences in this obscure region which are as yet insoluble on the ordinary assumptions of materialism. The evidence will, of course, appeal to different minds with different degrees of force, and indeed to the same mind at different times very differently. Personal experience of, or first-hand acquaintance with similar phenomena will count for much in the estimate put upon the narrative of such experiences in the case of others. But for ourselves, we do not see how it can be successfully denied that such supernormal events as Mr. Lang relates occur. What interpretation is to be put on them is a different story. The savage man has been prone to explain supernormal knowledge of the remote, for example, by the assumption of the wandering of the separable soul temporarily from the body. Mr. Lang seems now and again to suggest that it may be explained as a telepathic communication from one mind to another. Others fall back on the assumption of common participation in the universal fühlende Seele, or on common contact with the Absolute. The savage man's theory does not seem the worst of these guesses. Rather than accept any of which, we prefer to remain, like Mr. Lang, without a theory, meanwhile abiding content with the conviction that there are experiences that come to the human animal which shake the foundations of the materialistic hypothesis. Quote, "No more than any other theory, nay, less than some other theories, can it account for the psychical facts which, at the lowest, we may not honestly leave out of the reckoning," end quote, page 172. The great success of the volume is attained, however, in the discussion of the second of the questions to which it is devoted. Here, by an array not of strange experiences drawn from dubious borderland, but of plain and open facts, Mr. Lang demonstrates that so far from belief in a moral supreme being being the last result of a slow evolution, due to the action of advancing thought upon the original conception of ghosts, it occurs, often apart from the conception of ghosts, in the lowest known grades of savagery, in a strikingly pure and complete form, and is so widely spread as to suggest its aboriginal universality. The novelty of this exhibition is perhaps not so great as Mr. Lang thinks, though it is doubtless very novel indeed in the scientific circles for which he specially writes, but the importance of his solid contribution to the establishment of the fact cannot easily be overestimated. After his marshalling of illustrative cases, drawn from every part of the world, and his luminous discussion of the relations of their theism to the other beliefs of savages, it would seem that the crudities of the animistic theory of the origin of the idea of God are forever antiquated. Quote, "The savage supreme being," says Mr. Lang, "with added power, omniscience, and morality, is the idealization of the savage as conceived by himself, minus a fleshly body as a rule, and minus death. He is not necessarily a spirit, though that term may now be applied to him. He was not originally differentiated as spirit or not spirit. He is a being, conceived of, without the question of spirit or no spirit being raised. Perhaps he was originally conceived of before the question could be raised by man. In the original conception he is a powerful intelligence who was from the first, who was already active long before by a breach of his laws, an error in the delivery of a message, or breach of ritual, or what not, death entered the world. He was not affected by the entry of death, he still exists." End quote, page 204. In a word, the supreme God of the lowest races, who stands behind and above their animism and fetishism, and even his own mythology, page 198, has not been conceived metaphysically but religiously. He was not primarily a spirit, he was and remains the eternal, omniscient, ethical creator, ruler, and judge of all things. No wonder that Mr. Lang is impelled to exclaim, quote, "These high gods of low savages preserve from dimmest ages of the meanest culture the sketch of a god, which our highest religious thought can but fill up to its ideal," end quote, page 208. To the origin of this conception he devotes little discussion, contenting himself with hints that he would reject the assignment of it to a special primeval revelation, and would look with favour on the supposition that it represents an instinctive operation of the causal judgment, seeking an adequate cause for the universe, to which he doubtless would not object to adding the action of that sense of dependence and responsibility which seems native to man as man. Its history he is inclined to trace in a progressive degeneration, incident to the very advance of culture, the vera causa of which he discovers in the quote, attractions which animism, when once developed, possessed for the naughty natural man, end quote, page 282. He tentatively suggests that 4 stages in this history may be traced, represented by 1, the Australian unpropitiated moral being, 2, the African neglected being, still somewhat moral, 3, the relatively supreme being involved in human sacrifice, as in Polynesia, and 4, the moral being reinstated philosophically, or as in Israel, page 329. Whether, however, these stages can be made out or not, the massive evidence offered for the main proposition is overwhelming, and we think Mr. Lang has shown with a clearness and force which should convince the most recalcitrant that the conception of a supreme being, the cause of all existences and the moral ruler of the universe, is native to the human race, is possessed by even the lowest representatives, and can only with difficulty be eradicated or even obscured. It is natural, of course, that Mr. Lang should wish to see how far his conclusions, quote, can be made to illustrate the faith of Israel, end quote. His closing chapter is given to this subject. Perhaps it is not the most satisfactory portion of his book. Mr. Lang is as chary of the directly supernatural as most men of science of the day. But apart from this, his remarks on the Israelitish religion and its course are most suggestive. He naturally looks upon the belief in Jehovah as, quote, a shape of the widely diffused conception of a moral supreme being, at first, or at least when our information begins, envisaged in anthropomorphic form, but gradually purged of all local traits by the unexampled and unique inspiration of the great prophets, end quote, page 294. Quote, had it not been for the prophets, he remarks, Israel, by the time that Greece and Rome knew Israel, would have been worshipping a horde of little gods and even beasts and ghosts, while the eternal would have become a mere name, perhaps like Ndengi and Unkulunkula, a jest. The Old Testament is the story of the prolonged effort to keep Jehovah in his supreme place. To make and succeed in this effort was the differentia of Israel. Other peoples, even the lowest, had, as we prove, the germinal conception of a God, but their foolish heart was darkened, end quote, page 220. Upon the current critical theories of the origin of Jehovah worship, Mr. Lang accordingly pours a well-deserved scorn. Quote, have critics and manual makers, he exclaims, no knowledge of the science of comparative religion? Are they unaware that peoples infinitely more backward than Israel was, at the date supposed, have already moral supreme beings acknowledged over vast tracts of territory? Have they a tittle of positive evidence that early Israel was benighted beyond the darkness of Bushmen, Andamanis, Pawnees, Blackfeet, Hurons, Indians of British Guiana, Dinkas, Negroes, and so forth? Unless Israel had this rare ill luck, which Israel denies, of course Israel must have had a secular tradition, however dim, of a supreme being, end quote. Page 312. The uniqueness of the religious history of Israel does not then consist in the mere fact of its theism, but in the preservation and on the whole steady elevation, not of course without periods of decline and degeneration, which Mr. Lang paints far too black, page 283, of this universal high theism. In the account to be given of, quote, the historically unique genius of the prophets, end quote, by whose instrumentality Israelitish theism was thus preserved and developed, Mr. Lang certainly falters. The divine purpose was exhibited in it, he is driven to admit, but beyond that single admission he will not go. But of the fact he is clear. Here is a unique experience among the races of men, the progressive broadening and deepening of primitive theism in one race under the influence of a series of unparalleled religious teachers until a greater than all the prophets came to birth. And the uniqueness of the experience of Israel is all the more marked because of the relative indifference of Israel to the second stream of influence, which, in Mr. Lang's theory, enters into the formation of religion in our modern conception of that term. quote, "The great prophets of Israel and Israel generally were strangely indifferent to that priceless aspect of animism, the care for future happiness, as conditioned by the conduct of the individual soul," end quote, page 329. Quote, "They carried theism to its austere extreme. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, while unconcerned about the rewards of animism," end quote, page 295. And so it seems that, quote, "early Israel, having, as far as we know, a singular lack of interest in the future of the soul, was born to give himself up to the developing, undisturbed, the theistic conception, the belief in a righteousness eternal," end quote, page 333. We may not find here quite all that we could wish, but surely we find what is fundamental in the Christian conception of the history and mission of the religion of Israel and the germ of much else. One feels that Mr. Lang needs only to give a somewhat more detailed study to the development of that religion to be forced to posit something more than what we may speak of as natural inspiration in the prophets, for example, in order to account for their unique work. And one is strengthened in such a feeling by reading such a treatise, for example, as Griesebrechts Die Berufsbegabung der alttestamentlichen Propheten. Griesebrecht is quite as keen as Mr. Lang can be to account as far as possible for the prophetic teaching on natural grounds, i.e. without the assumption of direct supernatural revelation, and his postulation of a natural Ahnungsvermögen as the basis of the prophetic phenomena would, one would think, be attractive to Mr. Lang. But a reader of Mr. Lang's acuteness would soon discover that even Griesebrecht does not succeed in accounting for the prophetic phenomena by eliminating all direct supernatural communication from them, and we fancy his candour would gradually lead him to the conviction that there is a deep discrimination between religions that he has not yet clearly made, which nevertheless the facts require. A discrimination by which, over against those religions which are the product of men's reaching up after God, if haply they may grasp him, is set the religion which is the product of God's reaching down to men, if haply he may restore them to communion with himself. End of review of The Making of Religion by B.B. Warfield. Review of Naturalism and Religion by B.B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Naturalism and Religion by Dr. Rudolf Otto, Professor of Theology in the University of Göttingen. Translated by J. Arthur Thompson, Professor of Natural History in the University of Aberdeen, and Margaret R. Thompson. Edited with an introduction by Reverend W. D. Morrison, LLD, New York, G.P. Putnam's Sons, London, Williams and Norgate, 1907. Crown, octavo, pages 11 to 374. Dr. Otto is introduced by his English editor to his new audience as, quote, "a thinker who possesses the rare merit of combining a high philosophic discipline with an accurate and comprehensive knowledge of the science of organic nature," end quote. The appearance of the name of Professor Thompson on the title page of the book as translator may be taken as an additional guarantee of the scientific competency of the author. The book itself fully meets the expectations so aroused. We do not indeed share the author's philosophical standpoint, and still less can we homologate the theological conceptions which may occasionally be read between the lines. But there can be no question that the book is ably thought and attractively written, or that its author is exceptionally well informed in the current scientific discussion of Germany, and is exceptionally well equipped to expound it alike in its details and in its general drift. As a result, we have in the book an admirable survey of recent German speculation on the origin and nature of the world and man, and a strong and convincing defense of the right of religion in the face of modern thought. Dr. Otto calls his book Naturalism and Religion and explains its purpose as, quote, "in the first place to define the relation or rather the antithesis between the two, and secondly to endeavor to reconcile the contradictions and vindicate against the counterclaims of naturalism the validity and freedom of the religious outlook," end quote, page 1. Or, as he somewhat more crisply expresses it at a later point, quote, "to define our attitude to naturalism and to maintain in the teeth of naturalism the validity and freedom of the religious conception of the world," end quote, page 278. The real subject of the book is, therefore, naturalism, and its real purpose is to assert over against naturalism the right of religion. Its primary purpose, in other words, is polemic rather than constructive. It is less concerned with the positive exposition and development of the religious conception of the world than with the vindication of the right of a religious conception of the world. Of course, Dr. Otto has not written so much without suggesting what, in his view, the religious conception of the world includes. He has even formally outlined and briefly expounded and even argued its elements, but neither the strength nor the mass of the book is given to it, but is expended rather on a careful, critical survey of current forms of naturalism, with a view to exhibiting its essential failure. From our point of view, the value of the book is immensely increased by this circumstance, for Dr. Otto's philosophical and even theological conceptions would necessarily dominate his positive construction of the worldview to which he would give the name of religious, and as we have already explained, we do not particularly care for Dr. Otto's philosophical or theological views. But in his exposition and criticism of naturalistic theories, he is moving on ground common to all who would cherish a religious worldview of any sort, and here we can follow his lucid expositions and his trenchant criticisms with unalloyed satisfaction. Dr. Otto's philosophical standpoint is that of a convinced Kantian idealism, or perhaps we ought rather to say he is a disciple of that mixed product of Kant and Jacobi, Jakob Friedrich Fries, who has lately been disinterred in Germany and given at least some semblance of renewed vitality. Although he doubtless transcends Fries's anti-teleological view of nature, some slight echo of it may perhaps be detected in his willingness to admit that a direct study of nature will not yield a teleological view of it. The Friesian leaven is more in evidence, however, in his view of religion as rooted primarily in a sense of mystery, upon which he then engrafts, to be sure, the sense of dependence in which religion centers, and the conception of teleology in which, we may say, it culminates. The peculiar extension he gives to the implications of the feeling of dependence, by which he derives from it the assurance not only that man, the subject of this ineradicable and surely not misleading feeling, is a contingent being, but that so is the whole world itself, has perhaps its roots in the same idealism. The external world, which is our creation, can scarcely be less dependent than the beings whose creation it is. One gets the impression that Professor Otto's objection to naturalism turns less on the obliteration by naturalism of the distinction between matter and mind than on naturalism's attempt to work this obliteration the wrong way about. The external world from which naturalism would explain mind, he would rather explain from mind, and so it comes about that as the argument runs on it seems almost to become rather a plea for spiritualism than for what we commonly speak of as a religious interpretation of the world. Its thesis almost appears to be summed up in the striking and strikingly true remark, page 283, that, quote, mental science, from logic and epistemology up to and including the moral and aesthetic sciences, proves by its very existence and by the fact that it cannot be reduced to terms of natural science, that spirit can neither be derived from nor analyzed into anything else, end quote. At this point, however, we are a little puzzled by the rushing in of another current of Dr. Otto's thought, which almost sweeps away this spirit, the substantial existence of which he seems to have so firmly established. We must not talk, it seems, of its, quote, substantial nature, end quote, page 330. It is a matter of entire indifference, page 331. What concerns us is only, quote, its incomparable value, end quote, page 331. Quote, what lives in us is not a finished and spiritual being, but something that develops and becomes actual very gradually, end quote. Page 298. Whence it comes, who can tell, or whither it goes? All we know of it is, lo, it is here, and that it is the manifestation of something that is. Quote, there is no practical meaning in discussing its origin or its passing away, as we do with regard to the corporeal. Under certain corporeal conditions it is there, it simply appears, but it does not arise out of them. And as it is not nothing but an actual and effectual reality, it can neither have come out of nothing nor disappear into nothing again. It appears out of the absolutely transcendental, associates itself with corporeal processes, determines these and is determined by them, and in its own time passes back from this world of appearance to the transcendental again, end quote, page 358. Is this only one way of saying that, quote, the soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting and cometh from afar, end quote, or does it, as we much doubt, mean much more than this? Decidedly, Dr. Otto's philosophy needs watching, and we may be glad it does not form the staple of this book, but only lies in its background. What forms the staple of this book is the exposition and criticism of naturalism. Naturalism, he tells us, exists in two forms, naive and speculative naturalism entrenches itself in two great contentions, the one embodied in the Darwinian doctrine of evolution, the other in the mechanical theory of life. To the exposition and criticism of these two great contentions of naturalism, Dr. Otto accordingly devotes himself. To the Darwinian theory, chapters 4 to 7, pages 85 to 186 are given. To the mechanical theory of life, chapters 8 to 11, pages 187 to 359. The discussion in both cases is full, the exposition clear, the criticism telling. In dealing with the Darwinian theory, Dr. Otto very properly distinguishes between the theory of descent in general and the specific form given this theory by Darwin's hypothesis of the indefiniteness of variations and the survival of the fittest in the struggle for existence. The former, he points out, has maintained its ground, or perhaps we may even say has strengthened its stakes. Dr. Otto intimates, almost as a matter of course, his own adhesion to it. The latter, on the contrary, has become, in the estimate of wide circles, not merely suspect, but even disproved. Dr. Otto intimates that he himself will have none of it. But it is precisely in this peculiarly Darwinian theory of, quote, natural selection, end quote, that the virus of naturalism in current evolutionary speculation is prominent. The theory of descent is in no sense specifically Darwinian. It is far older than Darwin and remains the conviction of multitudes who are definitely anti-Darwinian. What is specifically Darwinian is the appeal to the factors of overproduction, indefinite variation, struggle for existence and consequent elimination of the unfit and the survival of the fittest as containing in themselves the true account of the modifications which have produced the multitudinous forms of life. Thus, teleology was reduced to an illusion and suitability substituted in its place. Utility became the one sufficient creator of all that is living. The widespread dissatisfaction with, and even rejection of, this account of organic development, which marks the present state of discussion, may be taken as at the same time, therefore, a refutation of the naturalism which underlies it, because it is an exhibition of the inadequacy of mere utility to account for all things. As investigation has gone on, it has become clearer and clearer to numerous students of the subject that variations do not occur indifferently in every direction, but turn up opportunely. As Dubois-Raymond expressed it in his vivid way, nature's dice are loaded. Not accidentalism, but purpose rules her acts. The greater organism of the animate world grows apparently like the lesser organism of the individual being along fixed lines by definite steps to determined ends. Natural selection may have a part to play in the process, but it is in wider and wider circles coming to be believed that it is a very subordinate part. It can work only on what is given it, and it does not seem to have indefinite variations in every direction to work on, but rather very definite variations in one direction. The goal attained is therefore not determined by it, but by the inherent tendency of the developing organism. So at least an increasing number of students of nature are coming to think. Dr. Otto's method is marked by a very large infusion of the concessive spirit. He betrays no tendency to drive antitheses into contradictions, and he does not permit the cause of teleology in nature to be identified with the extremist anti-Darwinian opinions. On the contrary, he is quick to point out that purpose has no quarrel with means, and can live therefore under the strictest reign of law. It is not law which is fatal to purpose, but chance. Nay, says he, quote, absolute obedience to law and the inexorableness of chains of sequence are, instead of being fatal to teleology, indispensable to it, end quote. Quote, when there is a purpose in view, he argues, it is only where the system of means is perfect, unbroken, and absolute, that the purpose can be realized, and therefore that intention can be inferred, end quote, page 83. Accordingly, therefore, he considers it possible to embrace in a teleological interpretation, quote, the whole system of causes and effects, which, according to the Darwin-Weismann doctrine, have gradually brought forth the whole diversity of the world of life, with man at its head, end quote. For why may not this be looked upon, quote, as an immense system of means, end quote, intricate no doubt, but working to its end with inevitable necessity, which may therefore be the manifestation of intention, page 151. At a later point, when dealing with the mechanical theory of life, he reverts to the same line of remark to show that mechanism has in it nothing inconsistent with purpose, pages 222 to 223. Mechanism may be only the way in which purpose realizes itself. Of course, the danger here is that we may fall thus into a deistic conception of the method of what we theologically call providence. But this does not seem necessary even when the whole of what we call nature is conceived as, quote, a machine, end quote. Though the guiding hand of purpose be conceived as everywhere and at all times immediately operative, nevertheless the whole account of the several phenomena would be found in the efficient, not in the final causes. In no case are the final causes to be conceived as additional efficient causes producing with them a resultant effect. They are and remain only final causes and operate only through and by means of the efficient causes. Each phenomenon finds its whole account, when severally considered, accordingly in its efficient causes. It is therefore indifferent to purpose whether the events which occur under its government occur as products of mechanical or free causes. Providence, then, which is but another way of saying purpose, is as consistent with a mechanical theory as with any other theory of life, because purpose is not discerned in the separate phenomena, but in their combination. Romanus was quite right, therefore, when he regretfully said of his earlier mistake in ruling purpose out of the universe, quote, I had forgotten to take in the whole scope of things, the marvellous harmony of the all, end quote. Dr. Otto is anxious that his readers shall not make the analogous mistake of supposing that because a thing is caused, it is therefore not intended. He does not imagine, of course, that in this vindication of teleology in relation to mechanism, he has done all that is necessary to validate the religious view of the world. He rightly supposes, however, that he has done by it something to remove some current objections to the religious view of the world, for there are still some who imagine that when they say mechanism, they deny purpose. How far the alleged mechanism rules is another question. The most striking feature of Dr. Otto's method is, however, his employment of exposition as argument. His book thus becomes a mirror of current thought on the subjects with which he is dealing. The inherent weakness of the Darwinian construction of the factors of evolution, for example, he exhibits less by direct argument of his own against it than by a running exposition of the course of evolutionary thought in latter-day Germany. The first impression the reader gets from this survey is of the uncertainty of the conclusions which are from time to time announced. He soon perceives, however, that amid the apparent confusion there is a gradual and steady driftage in one direction, and that that direction is away from Darwin's conceptions. Whatever in the end he may come to think of Darwin's theory in its application to nature, he receives a strong impression that it is fairly illustrated in this section of human research and thought. Here is certainly exhibited indefinite variation in all directions, struggle for existence, and, let us hope, the survival of the fittest. It may become us to bear in mind, to be sure, that the survival of the fittest is not quite the same as the survival of the true. It may be only the survival of the theory that fits in best with the presuppositions and prejudices of the times. Nevertheless, truth is strong, and we can scarcely doubt it will finally prevail. And one gets the impression that, in this case, what seems likely to prevail in the meantime is the truth, and that this truth is hostile to the anti-teleological schematization of Darwin, and indeed to his whole construction of the main factors of evolution. Indeed, it seems at times as if the new investigators were inclined to react from natural selection a shade too violently, and not content with assigning Darwinismus to the Sterbebett, were determined to deny to natural selection not only any real effectiveness or capacity for species forming, but even reality itself. Professor Otto avoids this extreme. He not only recognizes its operation in nature as a vera causa, but points out that its obvious reality and actual working is the main cause of the attractiveness of the theory, which found in it the one great agency in species forming, pages 156 to 157. Nevertheless, he holds firmly with the more recent thought which discovers for it only a very subordinate role to play in nature, and he points out with great clearness that its dethronement and the substitution for it of theories of evolution dominated by the recognition of inherent tendencies in the organism and progression along right lines is the definite relegation of naturalism to the Sterberlager, so far as it had entrenched itself in the doctrine of evolution. In dealing with the mechanical theory of life, Professor Otto employs much the same method which he uses in dealing with the doctrine of evolution. Here too he avoids dogmatism and relies largely on the effect a mere tracing of the history of research is fitted to produce, for the progress of investigation has been away from the mechanical view of life. We have lived to see the dawn of a new age of vitalism, and even where the name is scouted and the thing deprecated, the edges of the old mechanical theory have become very frayed. On the basis of present-day thought, Dr. Otto is justified in emphasizing the mystery of life and in pointing decisively to the supremeness of mind, so making way for the religious view of the world from this point of sight also. Enough has doubtless been said to manifest the high value we place of Dr. Otto's discussion. It would be difficult to find elsewhere in such brief compass so full and lucid a survey of the recent German literature on evolution and the nature of life, and it would be, we are persuaded, impossible to find another work of such compressed form in which the failure of naturalism as a theory of the world is more tellingly argued. End of Review of Naturalism and Religion by B.B. Warfield. Review of Magic and Religion by B.B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Magic and Religion by Andrew Lang, author of Myth, Ritual and Religion, Custom and Myth, etc., octavo, pages 10 to 316, Longmans, Green & Co., 39 Paternoster Road, London, New York and Bombay, 1901. Into this volume Mr. Lang has gathered a series of papers. The most of them bear on the problem of the origin and early history of religion and tend to strengthen the hypothesis set forth in his Making of Religion, which was published in 1898 and favourably reviewed in this journal at that time. Volume 9, page 744. That hypothesis is stated by an unfriendly critic, Mr. Hartland, as follows. Quote, apparently it is claimed that the belief in a supreme being came, in some way only to be guessed at, first in order of evolution, and was subsequently obscured and overlaid by belief in ghosts and in a pantheon of lesser divinities. End quote. That is to say, Mr. Lang, setting himself against the current of popular speculation, supposes that belief in a supreme being, instead of arising as an evolution from a precedent ancestor worship, or animism, antedated those forms of belief. He was led to this conclusion, he tells us, page 224, quote, first by observing the reports of belief in a relatively supreme being and maker among tribes who do not worship ancestral spirits, end quote, and, quote, secondly by remarking the otiose, unworshipped supreme being often credited with the charge of future rewards and punishments among polytheistic and ancestor-worshipping people. End quote. In defense of himself, against Mr. Hartland's innuendo, Mr. Lang replies that it is true enough that he holds that belief in a, quote, creative being, not a spirit, merely a being, before ghosts are worshipped, came in some way only to be guessed at. But, he adds, if I am to have an hypothesis like my neighbours, I have suggested that early man, looking for an origin of things, easily adopted the idea of a maker, usually an unborn man, who was before death and still exists. Round this being crystallized affection, fear, and sense of duty, he sanctions morality and early man's remarkable resistance to the cosmic tendency, his notion of unselfishness. That man should so early conceive a maker and father seems to me very probable. To my critics it is a difficulty. No speculation seems more inevitable. End quote. Page 225. Readers of our review of Mr. Lang's Making of Religion, Volume 9, page 744, will remember that in this we are quite of Mr. Lang's mind. That man should instinctively, quote, project himself upon the heavens, end quote, seems to us so inevitable in fact, that we can account for the difficulties which his critics find with Mr. Lang's postulation of an anthropomorphic religion for early man only by a fatal one-sidedness in their methods, a one-sidedness which, in a word, forgets the subject in absorption of the object. It is not, after all, quote, primitive religion, end quote, in the abstract that we are in search of, but the primitive religion of man. And the primitive religion of man can never be reached by methods which leave out of consideration man himself, the producing cause of the thing we are investigating. Now, what we are saying amounts, of course, to suggesting that the so-called, quote, anthropological method, end quote, requires to be supplemented by the, quote, psychological method, end quote, in order that we may attain satisfying results in this sphere of investigation. No one will rise from reading the discussions of the origin and early forms of religion by our leading anthropologists without a strong conviction that what is needed by these writers is a fundamental study of the psychology of religion. The scoff implied in Mr. Hartland's professed inability to conceive how man could arrive directly at belief in a man-like supreme being grates a little on our susceptibilities. It is all very well to collect the phenomena of religion as they appear in the life of races and peoples and tribes, and to seek from these to construct a phenomenological schema of the course of religious development. Knowledge of how religion arises in the individual mind is, nevertheless, an indispensable prerequisite to the safe interpretation of these phenomena. No more here than in other spheres of investigation is it other than pseudoscience to seek to interpret phenomena apart from the constitutive factor by which they were produced. We are not saying that, quote, the anthropological method, end quote, is useless and can lead to no sound conclusions. On the contrary, we welcome Mr. Lang's investigations in this sphere just because, quote, the anthropological method, end quote, has in his hands led to sound conclusions which we think, on, quote, anthropological, end quote, grounds, pure and simple, must stand. Though these conclusions are powerfully commended to us because they are in harmony with the findings suggested to us by the psychological method also, yet their immense importance as, quote, anthropological, end quote, conclusions is revealed when we attend to another consideration. We can imagine anthropologists objecting to the use of the psychological method altogether, or at least looking at it with a certain chary distrust, on the ground of a formed or half-formed, or even perhaps subconscious, doubt whether it is legitimate to attribute to, quote, primitive man, end quote, the same mental movements observable in civilized man. We can imagine an extreme evolutionist saying, or at least feeling, that his business is to get behind the man whose mental workings he is conscious of in himself, or can observe in his fellows, or even to get behind man himself, at least as we know man, to the half-bestial creature that once was slowly becoming man. What he wishes to do is to observe how, in the process of other changes, this change also took place. This evolving being became a religious creature. Obviously, from this point of view, the intrusion into his work of considerations derived from a knowledge of the human mind as at present existing, and its normal workings, might confuse his entire reasoning. It is of the utmost significance that Mr. Lang steps in at just this point, and shows us that on, quote, anthropological grounds, end quote, themselves, quote, primitive religion, end quote, is exhibited as, quote, anthropomorphic, end quote, rather than as, quote, animistic, end quote, or quote, ancestor worshipping, end quote. And it is because he seems to us to have done this that we attach an importance to his writings on this subject that, from other points of view, might well seem excessive. Primitive man is observed to have actually reasoned humanly. Mr. Lang's main thesis, then, is, let us understand that, quote, nothing in savage religion is better vouched for than the belief in a being whom narrators of every sort call a creator who holds all in his power, end quote, pages 9 to 10, and that this supreme being is not, quote, envisaged as a spirit, but rather as a supernormal magnified man of unbounded power and of limitless duration, end quote, page 17. Thus, he contends, the earliest traceable form of religion was relatively high, and it was due to the process of social evolution that it subsequently deteriorated to the low forms now so prevalent among savages. Now, this opinion, he remarks, may be attacked on two sides. It may be said that the loftier religious ideas of the lowest savages have been borrowed from higher religions, into contact with which these savages have been brought, especially from Christianity or Islam. And the validity of the evidence itself by which these higher religious ideas are attributed to lower races may be assailed. The present volume is, for the most part, made up of essays in which these two modes of assault on his theory are met, although other factors in the problem and other attempts at a solution of it are also discussed. First, Mr. Tyler's theory of, quote, lone gods, or borrowed religion, end quote, is examined, and it is shown that it will not account for the situation. It remains a fact that low savages, the most remote in time and place from the possibility of having borrowed their, quote, high gods, end quote, yet do believe in a creator and moral governor of the world. Then Mr. Fraser's idea that magic has everywhere preceded religion, and indeed that religion has been invented only in despair of magic, when men had tried magic and found it wanting, is examined and equally found inconsistent with the facts. Quote, as to that despair, it does not exist. End quote. Religion is found not as the successor of magic, but existing fully developed side by side with superabundant magic. Next, the central argument of the new edition of Mr. Fraser's Golden Bough is taken up, that horrible theory of the origin of the Jewish feast of Purim, by means of which he fancies he can account for the ascription of deity to our Lord. In a running criticism covering about 125 pages, a criticism so desultorily written as to tax the patience of the reader sadly, this portentous piece of conjectural construction is fairly laughed out of court. Doubtless this was the right way to deal with the nest of unsupported and insupportable hypotheses out of which Mr. Fraser has built his castle in the air, but it makes certainly very confused reading. The result of the discussion is stated in a question thus, quote, seriously, have we not in all this book, i.e. the Golden Bough, to do with that method of arbitrary conjecture which has ruined so many laborious philosophies of religion? End quote. Two further essays carry on the general line of investigation to which the book is devoted. In one of these, Mr. Fraser's primal theory that built on, quote, the ghostly priest, end quote, is subjected to very telling criticism. In the other, South African religion is restudied with a view to validate its original recognition of a, quote, high god, end quote. The volume closes with 3 essays on folklore and magic which have no immediate relation to the main subject with which the volume deals. We cannot praise the form into which Mr. Lang has cast the greater part of the discussions included in these pages. It has all of Mr. Lang's worst faults in an exaggerated measure, but we consider the matter of the volume important as a buttress to the suggestions enunciated in The Making of Religion, and as a really conclusive exposure of the methods of Mr. Fraser in The Golden Bough. We do not see how anyone, after reading Mr. Lang's criticisms upon these methods, can treat the main lines of argument in that painful book seriously. End of Review of Magic and Religion by B.B. Warfield. Review of Mysticism in Christianity by B.B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysticism in Christianity by the Reverend W. K. Fleming, M.A., B.D., of the College of All Hallows, Barking, E.C., London, Robert Scott, New York and Chicago, Fleming H. Revell Company, 1913. Octavo, pages 10 to 282, Bibliographies and Indices. Mysticism and Modern Life by John Wright Buckham, Professor of Christian Theology in Pacific Theological Seminary, author of Christ and the Eternal Order, Personality and the Christian Ideal, etc., New York and Cincinnati, The Abingdon Press, 1915, 12mo, pages 256, Index. These 2 books illustrate a movement of recent thought which both of them are eager that we should recognize as in progress. This is a movement toward a reawakened interest in mysticism, and even towards a reversion to it as a satisfying religious point of view. Such a movement was for religious men inevitable in the prevalent decay of confidence in the Christian revelation. For mysticism is religion, and supplies a refuge for men of religious mind who find it no longer possible for them to rest on external authority, as George Tyrrell both expounded and illustrated for us. Once turn away from revelation, and little choice remains to you but the choice between mysticism and rationalism. There is not so much choice between these things, it is true, as enthusiasts on either side are apt to imagine. The difference between them is very much a matter of temperament, or perhaps we may even say of temperature. The mystic blows hot, the rationalist cold. Warm up the rationalist, and you inevitably get a mystic. Chill down a mystic, and you find yourself with a rationalist on your hands. The history of thought illustrates repeatedly the easy passage from one to the other. Each centers himself in himself, and the human self is not so big that it makes any large difference where within yourself you take your center. Nevertheless, just because mysticism blows hot, its eccentricity is the more attractive to men of lively religious feeling. But it is just as scornful as rationalism of the supernatural, of external revelation, of historical foundations for religion. Face to face with the supernatural revelations recorded in the Christian scriptures, it reduces them to mystical phenomena and assimilates them to the experiences of a Plotinus or of a Sadi. Face to face with the historical foundations of Christianity, it treats them as symbols of transactions which take place within the souls of men. It is of the very essence of mysticism to find God within the circle of the individual's experience. So soon as any other way of coming into contact with God is proposed than by sinking into ourselves, mysticism is radically deserted. And because not the perception of God, but God himself is found in the human soul, and by implication in every human soul, God is ultimately confounded with the human soul. At his deepest depths, man is God. No doubt, being a religion and not merely a philosophy, unification is presented by mysticism as an achievement rather than as a postulate. And no doubt we may learnedly distinguish between pantheism and panentheism, between pantheism and negativism. All such efforts to escape from the coils of the serpent, however, are futile. Mysticism, in its fundamental basis of underlying conception, is just pantheizing anti-supernaturalism, and such it has shown itself, in greater or less purity of manifestation, in its entire historical development. This is what mysticism with a capital M is. Spell it with a lowercase m, and we may possibly broaden it out into only another name for natural religion. As it is religion, it is, of course, when so understood, admirable. As it remains natural religion, it is equally, of course, for fallen men inadequate. Its relation to Christianity is that of natural religion to the religion of revelation. It goes without saying that it finds, quote, for itself in Christianity a field of the richest and most fruitful soil, end quote. This is saying too little. We must say that only in Christianity can it attain its true development and complement. For Christianity is not an unnatural religion disputing the field of religion with natural religion. It is natural religion reinforced by supernatural republication and sanctions, and completed by the addition of what is needed for a religion for men in the unnatural condition induced by sin. It takes up natural religion into itself, and gives it the power to come to its rights, while it enlarges it by adding to it the supernatural religion needed for sinful man. But it goes equally without saying that mysticism, understood as natural religion, is not, in some of its less complete developments, confined to the soil of Christianity. Just because it is natural religion, it is present wherever human nature is present and functions religiously, and we do not need Schleiermacher to teach us that there is no human self-consciousness which is destitute of the God-consciousness. Of course, then, quote, it has been at the root of any and every religion worthy of the name, in its original and indefectible feeling after God, if haply it may find him, end quote. Whenever man exists, he is, quote, in contact, end quote, with God, and wherever men are in contact with God, they may know him, if only they will attend to him in contact with whom they are. We may even use the word know in its full sense. We see no reason to dispute Plotinus's dictum that God to be known must be seen or felt. If God be a mere hypothesis, however fully that hypothesis is verified, he can scarcely be said to be known. That he is, we may be sure, but to know that God is not yet to know God. We may acquire, after a while, good reason to believe that Mars, say, is inhabited. That would not warrant us in saying that we know the beings whose bare existence we have found reason to believe in. God is known only by those who, being in contact with him, have looked upon him with that eye of the soul to which he is invisible. If this be mysticism, we are all mystics, not merely Augustine with his doctrine of the intelligible world and the sensus internus by which it is perceived, but Calvin also with his doctrine of the sensus deitatis, which is the semen religionis. But it certainly is not mysticism in any historical sense of that term. The fault of the books, like those now before us, is that they confound capital M mysticism, which is pantheizing anti-supernaturalism, with lowercase mysticism, conceived as conscious living, moving, and having our being in God, and then interpret Christianity in terms of the resultant confused idea. The effect is to de-supernaturalize and de-historicalize Christianity and to reduce it to a merely natural religion, or rather to substitute merely natural religion for it. Christ is ranged with other masters, and the Christianity which he died to give to the world is explained as already in the possession of men, before and quite apart from him, as lying always, in fact, at the disposal of men in the depths of every man's own heart. This is the fundamental point of view which lies beneath and gives their ground colour to both of the books now before us, though it manifests itself in the discussions of each, of course, in a degree and manner of its own. Mr. Fleming's book is historical in form. Its task is to present a succinct account of the manifestations of mystical thought and of the mystical attitude in the historical development of Christianity. His mind is on mysticism with a capital M, and he represents its presence in the Christian life and thinking of the ages as the saving salt by virtue of which Christianity has been made and maintained as a religion. Mr. Buckham's book has more the form of a discussion of principles. Some of the chapters which constitute it were written originally for separate publication, and the unity of the volume suffers somewhat from this fact. But a sufficient internal unity is given to the whole by the common purpose, pervading all parts alike, to assimilate mysticism and Christianity to one another. This assimilation is effected by first interpreting mysticism in terms of Christianity. The stages of, quote, the mystic way, end quote, for example, are expounded in a fashion which may enable the Christian to receive it, but scarcely the mystic to recognize it as his own, and then interpreting Christianity in terms of mysticism. What comes out as a result is something which is neither mysticism nor Christianity, but a good deal more the former than the latter. Anti-doctrinal zeal is a fundamental trait of both books. Their misprision of evangelical teaching and practice is marked, their hatred of Calvinism and all its works intense, though not very intelligible or even intelligent. Observe this list of names brought together by Mr. Buckham as not very commendable for the theology they represent. Quote, Arius, Pelagius, Abelard, Dominic, Socinus, Calvin, the Westminster Divines, Priestley, end quote. It is interesting to observe what Mr. Buckham makes of Christianity in his determination to give it a common denominator with mysticism. In one passage, he formally expounds, quote, the essence of Christianity, end quote. We do not quarrel with him that in his anti-dogmatic zeal he seeks primarily the essence of Christianity as spiritual experience. What we quarrel with him for is the particular spiritual experience which he segregates as constituting the specific essence of Christianity. This he phrases as, quote, a filial communion and cooperation with God, so deep and real as to transform life, end quote. Obviously, there is nothing specifically Christian in this. Quote, this spirit came through Jesus, end quote, he says, but then he adds immediately, quote, not that it is absolutely new with Jesus, end quote. He adds again, indeed, quote, but it was so intense and fructifying as to exercise an almost, this almost is intensely revealing, creative influence upon those who came to share it with him and through him, end quote. But this does not remove the fatal fact that nothing exclusively Christian is discovered in the essence of Christianity. Christianity may bring what it brings with a special poignancy of appeal, but it is a matter of degree, not of kind, after all. So Pelagius said that men could be saved apart from Christianity as truly as by Christianity, only they could be saved more easily under Christianity, just as a boat would convey you from Carthage to Italy by sail more easily to yourself than if you had to row it across, but you could row it across all right if you had to. Christianity is a good religion, no doubt the best religion, but you can do very well without it. But now how did Mr. Buckham arrive at this remarkable essence for Christianity? By historical induction, it seems. Quote, it is only as we grasp that which is common in Christian experiences in the first century and in our own and in all that intervene that we understand the essence of Christianity, end quote, he tells us. And then he tells us that proceeding after this fashion he finds the essence of Christianity what we have seen. Did anybody ever reason with more delightful circularity? We presume that the spiritual experience of those alone who possess the essence of Christianity is truly Christian experience, and we presume equally that the essence of Christianity is the spiritual experience of those only who are truly Christians. We may know who are truly Christians by observing who have truly Christian experience, and we may know what truly Christian experience is by observing what is the experience of those who are truly Christians. Or shall we say rather that the spiritual experience common to all who call themselves Christians is the essence of Christianity. If only a single man from the time of Christ until today who has called himself a Christian and has not been truly a Christian be included in this induction, the conclusion is vitiated. We should get not what is common to all Christians, but what is common to Christians and non-Christians. This is what has happened to Mr. Buckham. He gives us not the essence of Christianity, which is a specific religion, but the essence, from his point of sight, of religion. And that is the reason why, after saying that this, quote, filial communion and cooperation with God, end quote, to be Christian, must be, quote, so deep and real as to transform life, end quote, he immediately, bethinking himself of the other religions with which Christianity is confounded in his thought, qualifies this and says of it that it is only, quote, an almost creative influence, end quote. We have noted that rationalism does not lie any too far away from mysticism. Mystics sometimes betray a tendency to rationalistic turns of thought. Mr. Buckham does not altogether escape. Does God send trouble is a question which seems quite to bowl over his attempt to interpret the universe in terms of God. In reporting the attitude of the mystic towards, quote, the disasters and ills, end quote, of life, he interjects a remark on his own account to the effect that these disasters and ills of life, quote, are acts of nature rather than of God, or his only as belonging to a world that is his, end quote. What wretched dualism have we here? Mr. Buckham seeks to salve his defection by intimating that mysticism at least does not go so far astray here as evangelicalism, that bête noire both of himself and Mr. Fleming. Quote, evangelicalism, he tells us, went too far, end quote, in the direction of attributing the dark and the storm to the sending of God, and interpreting, quote, the lightning javelins of fate as hurled by his hand, end quote. The mystic has not urged, he affirms, that disasters are direct acts of God, and especially not that they have been sent with punitive intent. He has only endeavored to utilize trouble when it comes for his own purification and perfection. All this is obviously not only unevangelical but irreligious, if we can make a distinction here. He who does not see the hand of God in all that befalls him is a rationalist more extreme than even such an extreme rationalist as Wilhelm Hermann. He has not only torn God out of his heart, where the mystic finds him, but even out of the universe, where the mere theist must see him. Quote, the experience of the mystics as a whole, writes Mr. Buckham, offers a striking exemplification of the saying of Christ as to the life of the kingdom consisting in a renewed childhood, end quote. What saying of Christ is this? Mr. Buckham seems conscious that there is something wrong here, for he immediately adds, quote, not that such a life has the weaknesses and limitations of childhood, but rather its vision, its faith, its confiding communion, end quote. Has childhood, infancy would be the truer term, quote, vision and faith and confiding communion, end quote. The mistake here is not to be condoned merely because it has become so common. The kingdom of heaven is not an infantile estate in which the immature alone may be at home, nor is it a child's paradise. Men are not to renew their childhood in it, but to put away childish things. We rise, not sink, into manhood, and the kingdom of heaven consists not in reduced men, but in enlarged men, built up into the fullness of the stature of manhood in Christ. What our Lord said was not that life in the kingdom consisted in a renewed childhood, but that no man can enter the kingdom save as an infant enters the world, naked and bare of all claims on his own behalf, utterly dependent on God for all and receiving all from his mere grace. It is to that state that we are to turn, humbling ourselves if we are to enter the kingdom. To receive the kingdom as a gratuity from God is a very different thing, however, from using it as a crèche. We may, of course, speak of a, quote, mystical aspect of Christianity, end quote, and we may even speak of the, quote, doctrine, or rather the experience of the Holy Ghost, end quote, as, quote, the real truth of mysticism, end quote. The term Christ mysticism may have a good meaning, but in the ambiguity of the word mysticism, all such modes of speech may also be gravely misleading. If it be true, as R.C. Moberly said it was true, that, quote, had only all Christians understood and lived up to their belief, end quote, in the Holy Ghost, quote, they would all have been mystics, end quote, it is certainly not true, what he immediately adds, quote, "or in other words, there would have been no mysticism," end quote. All Christians not only might have been or may be, but actually are mystics in the sense of the former clause. Communion with God is of the very essence of Christianity. Paul tells us in so many words that if any man hath not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. No man is a Christian who has not the experience of the indwelling Christ. But mysticism is still with us and is another matter. This is a pantheizing, anti-supernaturalistic religiousness which must not be permitted to come to us in the sheep's clothing of essential Christianity on the ground that it is only another name for spiritual inwardness. It is most decidedly something very different from that. End of Review of Mysticism in Christianity by B.B. Warfield. Review of The Ice Age in North America and its Bearings on the Antiquity of Man by B.B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ice Age in North America and its Bearings on the Antiquity of Man by G. Frederick Wright, D.D., LL.D., F.G.S.A., Professor in Oberlin Theological Seminary, Assistant on the United States Geological Survey, etc., with an appendix on The Probable Cause of Glaciation by Warren Upham, F.G.S.A., etc., with many maps and illustrations, New York, D. Appleton and Co., London, Caxton House, 1889, pages 18 to 622. In this sumptuous volume, Professor Wright has brought together in a form which appeals to the cultivated world, rather than solely to geological specialists, a full and very satisfactory account of glaciation and of the so-called glacial age, especially in North America. Beginning with a simple description of the nature of ice and its behavior as a semi-fluid, he carries the reader with him first to an examination of existing glaciers, and then to an investigation of the remains of the past glaciers which once covered the whole northern portion of the American continent. Nothing can surpass the expository skill with which the untechnical reader is made to understand the meaning of the various effects which have been wrought by the ice and the ice floods, and which stand as their monuments in the form of morainic ridges, drumlines, cames, kettle-holes, and terraces, and then to reproduce in imagination the geography of North America in pre-glacial and glacial time. On the cause of glaciation, Professor Wright occupies, page 440, a somewhat safe agnostic position. He is skeptical as to the astronomical theory of Mr. Kroll, which has had very great vogue, but which appears to be in conflict with the time measures which seem most easily and safely estimated. These seem to point to a period not more than from 7 to 10,000 years ago as marking the close of the Ice Age. Professor Wright also carries the lay mind with him in his suggestion that a single ice age with oscillations accounts better for the facts than the common assumption of two great and well-marked periods of general glaciation divided by a general period of warmer temperature. To the theologian, the most interesting problem connected with the Ice Age is that which concerns the antiquity of man. To this Professor Wright devotes 2 lucid and instructive chapters. That man existed on this continent not only at the close of this age, as the remains discovered in the Trenton gravels in Ohio and in Minnesota prove, but also for a long period during it, seems to follow from the discoveries by Mr. Cresson of wrought implements in the older deposits of the lower Delaware. What we are to think of the apparently still older remains from the western coast seems not yet obvious. It is perfectly true that all the older estimates of geological time are in course of a revision which much reduces their length, and that the close of the glacial era cannot now be assigned to a date much more remote than some 7,000 or 8,000 years. Possibly the oldest human remains of eastern America will not carry the direct evidence of man's existence back to more than double that age. But it would be rash to contend that man existed no earlier than he has been as yet traced by the chance relics that have been preserved of him in gravel heaps and caves. And if, as seems reasonable, the California evidence be admitted, new items of which Professor Wright has himself brought to light since his book was published, the direct witness to his existence may be pushed considerably further back. On the whole, an agnostic position is safest here too. Man seems to have existed on the globe at least 10 or 15,000 years. How much longer let the investigations of the future search out for us. Theology, at all events, has nothing to gain or lose by the result. It is exegetically untenable that the earlier genealogies of Genesis supply us with a basis for a chronology. The appearance of a linked chain of generations presented, at the first superficial glance, by Genesis 5 and 11 is delusive. The numbers there are obviously given for the different purpose of emphasizing the vigor and longevity of the antediluvians, and would not all be serviceable for a chronological purpose. As another purpose has to be called in order to account for them all, we have no right to assume that this was the purpose of any of them. Each sentence thus has its whole end in itself and is to be read separately. But if so, any number of generations may have occurred between each name mentioned, just as unnamed generations occurred in the course of the apparently similarly closely jointed genealogy of Matthew 1. The genealogical tables of the Old Testament, in a word, as Dr. W. H. Green has lucidly shown, do not supply the material for a chronology. The age of man on the earth is therefore a question in which theology as such has no more interest than she has in all truth. Theologians will look to the exegetes of the book of nature to read her this riddle, and will rest in their results. End of review of The Ice Age in North America and its Bearings on the Antiquity of Man by B. Warfield. Review of Miley's Systematic Theology by B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miley's Systematic Theology. Systematic Theology by John Miley, D.D., LL.D., Professor of Systematic Theology in Drew Theological Seminary, Madison, New Jersey, Volume 1, octavo, pages 16 to 533, New York, Hunt and Eaton, Cincinnati, Cranston and Stowe, 1892, $3. The high quality of the Biblical and Theological Library, now publishing by the Methodist Publication House, does honor to the great denomination which it represents. The latest issue in the series, Dr. Miley's Systematic Theology, is highly praised when it is recognized, as it must be, as worthy to stand in company with Dr. Bennett's Christian Archaeology and Dr. Terry's Biblical Hermeneutics. It is written with a direct lucidity, which is the natural expression of adequate knowledge and clear thinking. It presents its subject in orderly arrangement, in clear definition and with argumentative force, and it is characterized throughout by candor, restraint, and modesty, while a quiet humor occasionally subtly colors a phrase. It is altogether a good book, and the reader of it is sure to rise up and gratefully praise it. If he be an Arminian, he ought to find it a rarely judicious and well-reasoned exposition of his form of faith. If he be a Calvinist, he ought to count it a privilege to be enabled to consider the points in which the two great systems differ, under the leading of so competent a guide, and with such an entire absence of theological rancour. It is somewhat embarrassing to undertake the criticism of a half-finished book. In a case like the present, when the work is occupied with a well-known and well-compacted system, the end is indeed seen from the beginning, and yet there are individual ways of stating and defending, and indeed of conceiving, even the formative doctrines of a school of thought, which render it improper to anticipate their actual statement and exposition. In the present instance, the embarrassment is increased by the further fact that a number of detailed discussions underlying or expanding the treatment of matters embraced in the scheme of this first volume have been postponed to appendices to appear at the close of the second volume. There we are to look for full expositions of the doctrines of inspiration and of angels, a study of Romans 5 verse 12 and following, seeking to justify the rejection of the doctrine of the federal headship of Adam, which is thought by many of us to be taught in that text, and a historical review of the treatment of original sin by Arminian writers, which promises to be very interesting. The volume before us not only closes with anthropology, therefore, but does not give us the whole of the relevant material. Nevertheless, though with it alone before us we may not catch the proportion of doctrine as it lies in Dr. Miley's mind, we can scarcely fail to apprehend from his clear writing the elements of the doctrines which he presents. In an introduction of some 50 pages, Dr. Miley gives us his view of the nature, sources, scope, and method of systematic theology. We miss in this a satisfactory indication of the distribution of the disciplines in the Theological Encyclopedia, and this has affected somewhat the contents of the volume. To our thinking, the great subject of theism, which Dr. Miley makes the first division of systematic theology, belongs to the preliminary discipline of apologetics, and its treatment should either have been excluded from this treatise altogether, or made very summary and included in the prolegomena. This we say by way of mere formal criticism, for the actual treatment given to theism commands our admiration, especially the defense of God as an intuition, which in its last analysis amounts to a defense of a religious nature as a fundamental element of the human constitution. On the other hand, we find in this introduction a luminous discussion of such topics as these: the nature of scientific treatment, which is especially good with reference to the scientific treatment of separate doctrines; the nature of the scientific basis of Christianity, including an admirable statement of the place of reason in theology; the right of systematization and the value of doctrine; and the method of systematizing, in the course of which there is a very severe criticism of the so-called Christocentric model, and a possibly too extreme statement of the difficulty, Dr. Miley would say the impossibility, of finding one unifying principle in theology. Under this view, he holds that the work of systematizing is constructive and must, quote, proceed in a synthetic mode, end quote, i.e. must seek only a logical order. He therefore follows the customary order of topics, beginning with theology and proceeding through anthropology, Christology, soteriology, ecclesiology, and eschatology. We have no criticism to offer upon the adoption of this general scheme. Most schemes, under whatever name they are put forth, practically follow this order, but a criticism or two may be proper as to the distribution of the matter under these rubrics. We have already pointed out that theism is out of place under the first section, and finds its true position in the previous discipline of apologetics. We miss also under the first rubric, as is usual indeed in Arminian systems, but certainly unfortunate, any treatment of the plans or purposes of God. Dr. Miley perceives, no doubt, that God has not entered upon his works of creation and providence without a plan. He remarks incidentally on page 295, quote, creation has a purpose and a plan. All things were created in the divine pleasure and for the manifestation of the divine glory, to the end that men might know God and live to him as their supreme God, end quote. But he passes at once from the topic of the Trinity to that of creation, and this is apt to leave the impression that God is simple activity, and that he is not even rational in his works. For a synthetic order, we must have a discussion here of God's decree. We do not like either the line of division which is run between Christology and soteriology. Certainly if these rubrics are to be distinguished, the work of Christ must be subsumed along with his incarnation and person under the former, just as the work of God appears as creation and providence under the rubric of theology. Otherwise the work of Christ and of the Spirit are confused under the rubric of soteriology. Dr. Miley distributes the sources of theology broadly into nature and revelation, and discriminates these sources at page 9 most fruitfully on the basis of, quote, modes of knowledge, end quote. Knowledge acquired, quote, in the use of human faculties, end quote, is natural. That immediately communicated by divine agency is revealed. In the one case, quote, the mode of acquisition is purely human. The discovery of truth is mediated by the use of our own faculties, end quote. In the other, quote, it is immediately given by the supernatural agency of God, end quote. He remarks justly that, quote, our intuitions of truth are no exceptions, end quote, since intuition is a purely human mode of knowledge. The author remarks with justice, quote, it is important thus sharply to discriminate these two modes of truth, for only thus can we properly distinguish nature and revelation as sources of theology, end quote. For if we lay the stress on source or agency only without taking into account also the mode of knowledge in our definitions, we may find ourselves helpless before the presently common pantheizing conception of the world, which, by postulating immanent deity in all human thought, confounds the categories of reason and revelation. Readers of Dr. Whiten's recent little book called Gloria Patri will perceive how easy it is, through such a conception, to do practically away with the category of revelation altogether, by formally subsuming all the deliverances of reason under the category of revelation. We regret, therefore, to find Dr. Miley at a somewhat later point apparently deserting this ground. On page 11 we read that, quote, the defining fact, end quote, of revelation lies no longer in mode of knowledge, but apparently solely in agency. Quote, religious truth communicated through a supernatural agency of God is a revelation, end quote. And the way thus prepared, we read further that heathen men, feeling after God, if haply they may find him, may receive a divine revelation through their human faculties. Quote, according to the defining fact of revelation as above stated, any religious truth divinely given in such answer, though not verified to the recipient as from God, is yet a revelation, end quote. Quote, and to this source, he continues, we would trace the higher religious truths reached by heathen minds, rather than to unaided reason and the light of nature or to tradition, end quote. But according to the definition on page 9, the question whether they belong to the category of reason or revelation is not one of source merely, but of mode of knowledge as well, and specifically turns upon, quote, whether the acquisition of truth is in the use of human faculties, end quote. Dr. Miley appears to us to have stepped over the wall of his own just definition here into the preserve of the Quakers, with the effect of throwing himself helpless into the hands of the mystic rationalists. His doctrine of unrecognizable but real revelation to inquiring heathen is indistinguishable from the Logos doctrine which Dr. Briggs recently announced in his defense before his presbytery, and would logically lead to the broad conception of religion in which Gottlieb Philipp Christian Kaiser so rejoiced when he commended his biblical theology to readers, quote, who are observant students of mankind, and who, refusing to believe that any one church is in sole possession of salvation, are learning to find out and appreciate the honest worshippers of the divine in every age and clime, whose religion is neither Judaism, Christianity, Mohammedanism, nor paganism, but religious universalism, Catholicism in the true sense of the word, what our theologians call perfectible Christianity, end quote. On such a conception, in a word, there seems no imperative need for distinctive Christianity in the world. We must hasten to add that when Dr. Miley comes to treat formally of mysticism, page 16, he rejects the mystical path as a source of knowledge of religious truth altogether, thus, as it appears to us, reverting to his first and just position. He looks upon mysticism as, quote, the doctrine of an immediate insight into truth, end quote, this, quote, immediate insight into truth being through some form of divine illumination, the mind being divinely illuminated and lifted above its natural powers, and truth and God being immediately seen, end quote. Is not this just what he had postulated for seeking heathen? Yet he criticizes as follows, quote, there is a divine illumination which lifts the soul into a higher capacity for knowing God and truth, but there is no new revelation. There are promises of divine inspiration as the mode of higher revelations of truth, but definitely and exclusively to the chosen mediums of such inspiration and revelation, end quote, i.e. to the prophets and apostles. We know not how these statements can be accorded with the former teaching of a not uncommon revelation to heathen seekers, unless we are to suppose that God is nearer to heathens than to Christians, and deals more intimately with them than with Christians. It is worth noting further in this same connection that in the section which deals with the modern doctrine of, quote, Christian consciousness, end quote, Dr. Miley not only rejects it altogether as a source of Christian doctrine, but even goes to the unwarrantable extreme, as we think it, of refusing to allow, quote, that certain facts of Christian experience witness to the truth of certain correlate tenets of doctrine, end quote, page 18. He says, page 19, quote, no soul ever reached it, end quote, i.e. Christian consciousness, quote, or ever can reach it, through reason or the light of nature. Its essential precondition is knowledge of Christian truth, end quote. And we may note, by the way, the skill and success with which Dr. Miley treats in general the whole matter of the relation of reason and feeling. We should particularly like to quote a fine passage on page 40 as to the value of feeling in religion and its relation to reason. Compare also pages 48 and 49. The topics which fall under the head of theology proper are treated with sufficient fullness and great logical power, along with considerable self-restraint. The term attribute is confined to too narrow a sense, being limited to those constitutive of personality, but the distinction between these, quote, personal attributes, end quote, and all others is sound and fruitful. The first of these, quote, personal attributes, end quote, the divine intellect, is discussed under the caption of omniscience, the perplexities presented by which under the constitutive Arminian principle of freedom are not disguised, page 189 and following. Among these perplexities, Dr. Miley does not include, however, the divine foreknowledge of free actions. This he explains under the category of scientia media, page 189, and defends not only powerfully, but quite unanswerably against the arguments of Dr. McCabe, page 181 and following. We cannot think, however, that he has followed his own arguments to their legitimate end. These arguments not only involve the Calvinistic doctrine of the certainty of free actions, as distinguished from necessity, page 183, but also distinctly imply predestination. For example, it is argued by way of a reductio ad absurdum that the difficulties asserted to stand in the way of God's foreknowing the free acts of men press equally upon his foreknowledge of his own free acts. Quote, if future free volitions are unknowable because free, or unknowable for any other reason, then such volitions of God are as completely beyond the reach of his prescience as the future volitions of men, end quote. This is acute, and will prove very difficult to answer. It will require an even more acute logic, however, to distinguish between God's foreknowledge of his future choices and his foreintention to make those choices, which is just Calvinistic predestination, and as it will be difficult to disentangle the future choices of God from those of his creatures with which they are woven in the actual web of life, it will be exceedingly difficult to deny these creature choices also a place in the one comprehensive plan already foreknown in all its parts in eternity, and therefore foreintended or predestinated. Again, the objection that it would be inconsistent with the divine goodness to create souls whose rejection of salvation is certainly foreknown is justly set aside with the remark that nescience will not obviate the objection, inasmuch as it presses almost equally against the creation of souls with the known possibility of their loss, and quite equally against the continuance of the race after the experienced fact of such numerous losses. But surely the bottom is not reached thus, for if God creates souls which he foreknows will certainly be lost, he must, in this sense, create them with the intention that they will be lost, and this is the whole content of the Calvinistic doctrine of predestination in the case of that decretum horribile, to which men seem so ineradicably to object, but which is as surely a truth of reason as it is of Scripture. The real difficulty here Dr. Miley finds in the very existence of moral evil under the government of God, and when he comes to speak of the origin of evil, he allows that a complete theodicy is unattainable to human knowledge, page 429 and following. We cannot consent to stop, however, at the point at which he elects to stay his efforts to discover one. In this matter, as elsewhere, he appears to act upon a principle which is naturally very attractive to minds of analytical power, the principle of divide et impera. The danger is that in the analysis, the essence of the question may slip out between the joints. This is what happens here. Dr. Miley shows in turn, 1, that the creation of moral beings is permissible, 2, that a probationary economy is permissible, and 3, that therefore the fall which was contemplated as a possibility in the probationary economy is permissible. Excellent, we say. But we still ask, for Dr. Miley fully accepts the doctrine of the divine foreknowledge as we have seen, how was it consistent with God's holiness and goodness that he should create these moral beings and put them in a probationary economy, knowing beforehand, not that they might possibly fall, but that they certainly would fall? The only tenable ground here is the Calvinistic ground that such action on God's part, of course, involves his creation of man with the intention, in this sense, that he would fall, and the only possible direction in which to look for a theodicy is in that of an end great and glorious enough to justify the incidental evil arising from this cause. John Wesley saw this, but Dr. Miley rejects Wesley's suggestion out of hand, and with it all similar and better ones, for there are better ones, with the remark that it involves the implication that sin could have been prevented consistently with human freedom, which cannot be true, he adds, since in that case, quote, the fall itself must have been completely within the disposition of divine providence, end quote, page 439. But certainly this implication is true, even on the basis of natural religion, and a single question would seem to uncover the fallacy of Dr. Miley's opposite assertion. What required God to create just those free agents whom he foreknew would fall? Why could he not confine himself to creating such as he foreknew would stand in their probation? Or shall we say that while he foreknew that some angels would stand and others fall, it was impossible for him to create a human free agent whom he could foreknow would stand? In that case we must say either that human free action cannot be foreknown, which is contrary to Mr. Miley's doctrine, or else that all possible human beings would certainly fall, which would seem to carry back their fall to necessity of nature. Thus, even on Dr. Miley's own ground, it would seem that we must recognize the fall as, quote, completely within the disposition of divine providence, end quote, and must allow that God made man thus and not otherwise, and placed him in these conditions and not others, knowing that he would fall, and in that sense intending him to fall, and that is but to say that the permission of the fall entered into God's eternal plan, and must be justified by the ultimate end in view. We may be able to assign this end, or we may not, but we must believe that it exists, and that it will be sufficiently glorious to justify the incidental evil arising in the course of its prosecution. In these remarks on the origin of evil we have, of course, passed out of the domain of theology into that of anthropology, leaving much behind which we should have liked to speak of. It is in the anthropology of the volume, of course, that the Calvinistic reader will find most which seems to him open to question, and this all the more that Dr. Miley occupies here the extremist Arminian ground. We find much here in the way of careful statement and candid treatment to admire, and we willingly bear our witness to the fairness with which the Augustinian positions are stated. Dr. Miley divides the great question of original sin into the three of whether there is such a thing as native depravity, whether it is penal, and whether it is guilty. Only the first of these does he answer affirmatively. His doctrine is that all men are natively depraved, and out of that depravity will certainly commit actual sin, but that this depravity comes to them only through the law of nature, that like begets like, and is in no sense penalty, and thus that because they are born with it and do not themselves produce it, they cannot be held responsible for it, and it is therefore, as our New England brethren have learnt to call it, an, quote, uncondemnable vitiosity, end quote. Of course, we shall not commit the folly of attempting to refute this, as it seems to us, very refutable position in the course of a brief notice. Let us only remark briefly that it passes the comprehension of our Calvinistically warped mind to understand how so careful a thinker can, on the one hand, hang the whole weight of depravity on a law of nature, and on the other deny the condemnability of a state of depravity which inevitably produces sin in every action into which it issues. As to the former matter, what is a law of nature but a generalized fact, and what explanation of a fact can be found in simply generalizing it? Even the foolish king was not satisfied, when asking how the apple got into the dumpling, to be told that all dumplings have apples in them. To point to the law of nature, that like begets like, as the explanation of universal depravity, can mean nothing more than to subsume this fact as a specific case under the general law of heredity. The mind immediately wants to know, then, why is Adam's depravity, and not that perhaps greatly increased, or perhaps it may be the greatly lessened, depravity of his nearer ancestry that one inherits, a matter by no means explained by Dr. Miley's brief remarks on it. And the mind further wants to know who made this a law of nature, and what right it has to be a law of nature. It wants to know whether this law of nature is not a cruel injustice, under the grinding working of which man has nothing to do but to curse God and die. As long as it is true that, quote, no theory could consent to a purely arbitrary implication of the race in the Adamic sin, end quote, so long will it be true that we must have an explanation of how it is just and right for man to inherit Adam's depravity, if we would justify the ways of God with man. To say that all that was threatened to Adam for sin, physical death and its precedent weaknesses and pains, and spiritual death or depravity, with its tendency to sin inevitably issuing in actual sinning, has been brought upon mankind simply on the basis of a law of nature, so that all the race is brought through the mediation of depravity into actual sin and guilt without the possibility of escape on the sole basis of a law of nature, is no just explanation at all. It is simply to deify a phrase. As to the demerit of native depravity, we recognize indeed the truth of Dr. Miley's contention that Arminianism cannot stand with its admission, but this seems to us as Calvinists only a refutation of Arminianism. Its denial involves, of course, a denial of ethical character to all merely subjective states. We had thought early in the volume that Dr. Miley could escape this extreme when we read, quote, "So much have our subjective states to do with our judgments, but we are responsible for these states and therefore for the judgments which they so much influence," end quote, page 42. But when Adam's primitive holiness fell to be discussed, page 409, our illusion was dissipated. It seems that Adam's holiness was, quote, "simply a quality of Adam's nature," end quote, and as such possessed no proper ethical element. It, quote, "was simply a subjective state and tendency in harmony with his moral relations and duties, but such a state, however real and excellent, and however pleasing to the divine mind, could not have any true ethical quality, or in any proper sense be accounted meritorious or rewardable," end quote. In like manner, our native depravity is only a subjective quality, and though non-excellent and displeasing to God, has no ethical quality. This seems to us most remarkable. Here is a depravity which originally arose in personal action, and which is apparently the same in us as in Adam, which is the spring of all our actual sins, and yet which is itself, however hideous, non-condemnable. The theory which requires such a view is in antagonism with the deepest convictions of the human mind. If God looks upon Adam and finds him with a subjective quality excellent and, quote, "pleasing to the divine mind," end quote, how should he not show him his pleasure? And if God looks upon us and finds us with a subjective quality non-excellent and displeasing to his holiness, how should he not show us his displeasure? Must we look upon God as the most unnatural being in the universe, as a being whose action is entirely divorced from his immanent choice? No wonder our Arminian brethren are continually telling us Calvinists that their God is not our God. End of Review of Miley's Systematic Theology by B.B. Warfield. Review of Some Loose Stones by B.B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Some Loose Stones being a consideration of certain tendencies in modern theology, illustrated by reference to the book called Foundations, by R.A. Knox, Fellow and Chaplain of Trinity College, Oxford, second impression, London and New York, Longmans, Green & Co., 1913, Crown, octavo, pages 14 to 233, indices. Mr. Knox is a member of that coterie of young Oxford Fellows out of which came the 7 Oxford men who wrote the liberal manifesto called Foundations. See the notice of it in this review for July 1913, 11.3, pages 5 to 6 to 5 to 8. Not being of their way of thinking, and naturally being aware of the approaching publication of the book, he greeted its birth with a brilliant satire, parodying Dryden's Absalom and Ahithophel under the somewhat lurid title of Absolute and a Bit of Hell. There were those who thought that if the book was to be attacked at all, it would better be seriously attacked, a proposition the universal validity of which would not have been allowed, to be sure, by John Calvin, say, or Pierre Véret, though we are not sure that Mr. Knox would care to support himself on the judgments of precisely these great men. At any rate, having enjoyed his burst of laughter, Mr. Knox has turned to earnest remonstrance and has written this volume of criticism in which he traverses the main positions taken up by the authors of Foundations. He still, however, conceives himself to be engaged rather with the writers of Foundations than with their doctrines, or rather, perhaps we should say, he conceives himself to be engaged with their doctrines primarily not on their own account, but as expressions of the personalities of their propounders. He insists that he is not writing a theological book, he is rather occupied, he suggests, in a study in psychology. What interests him particularly is the psychology, the, quote, far more intricate psychology, end quote, he says, than that of, quote, the prophets or the apostles, or of the fathers or of the schoolmen, end quote, of, quote, the modern theologian, end quote. The most wonderful thing about our wonderful modern theology, to Mr. Knox, is apparently that there are people who can think that way. Even the attitude of the modern theologian to his tasks seems to Mr. Knox an odd one. The modern theologian is apparently less concerned in the discovery of precisely what is true about Christianity than in the ascertainment of how much can be made easily to pass as true among, quote, modern men, end quote. He seems oppressed by the mass of scientific opinion around him, but what daunts him is not so much the effect of this scientific opinion on his own faith as, quote, its effects on the faith of other people, end quote. Therefore, there enters into all his work an apologetic tone which produces even, quote, at times a cynical indifference to absolute truth, end quote. Quote, for we are not concerned now to find how we can represent truth most adequately, but how we can represent it most palatably. We ask of a doctrine not, is it sound, but couldn't we possibly manage to do without it? Not, is it true, but can I induce Jones to see it in that light? Jones has been to college and has heard of Hegel, end quote. He is a good man, anima naturalita Christiana, and all that. But when it comes to Christian doctrine, Jones has difficulties. Concessions are in order. It will not do to estrange Jones's modern mind. Mr. Knox is outraged by such an attitude. Quote, the great argument used now against any theological proposition, he breaks out, is not that it is untrue or unthinkable or unedifying or unscriptural or unorthodox, but simply that the modern mind cannot accept it. It is the modern mind that accepts this and rejects that expresses itself in terms of A rather than in terms of B, that thinks along these lines rather than along those, that shrinks or ratifies or demands. And after reading a few paragraphs of such ostensibly psychological discussion, I find myself sorely tempted to exclaim in an equally psychological spirit, if the modern mind has really got all these peculiar kinks about it, then in heaven's name let us trepan it, end quote. Even this, however, is, according to Mr. Knox, not the worst of the matter in the case of the authors of Foundations. The Jones, to whom they are so assiduous in adjusting their teaching, is a, quote, back number, end quote. Quote, in a word, our objection is not that Jones is unreal or unimportant or unrepresentative, but that he is 60, end quote. It was 40 years ago that Jones went to college, and the strenuous efforts which the authors of Foundations are making, quote, to convert our great-uncles, end quote, must strike the really modern mind as a sad anachronism. The world has moved in this generation. Tempora mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. This modern mind, to fit it into the queer corners of which the authors of Foundations are so busy whittling down Christianity, always an impertinence, has become fairly non-existent. Jones has receded into the background, and his grandchildren are of a very different temper. They wish no accommodations of doctrine made for them. Quote, I have never met, outside of senior common rooms, any demand from questioners for restatement or accommodation of my beliefs to theirs. They want rather to know what the Church does say, in order to see whether they can accommodate their beliefs to mine. End quote. Quote, against all this complicated process, I am convinced that the cry of the average man is, tell me what you do believe and always have believed, and then I will see about it. End quote. Quote, the modern mind does not want pulp, it wants something that it can close its teeth on. End quote. Quote, more dogma is wanted, pulpits full of it. End quote. The actual mind of the day demands not quieting compromises, but clearly cut differentiations and consequent consistency of convictions. The fundamental difficulty of the modern theologian, leading him to sit loosely to Christian truths, lies, Mr. Knox thinks, in his method of approach to them. He approaches them by way of hypothesis instead of by way of presupposition, or an a posteriori rather than a priori. Looking at them only as so many propositions proposed for consideration, and approaching them, professedly, wholly without prepossessions, he sets to work framing hypotheses on the ground which they may be accounted for. Obviously, any number of conflicting hypotheses may be framed. There are few bodies of alleged facts which may not find some kind of explanation on any one of a score or of 100 hypotheses. And at the last resort, there always remains the simple explanation of the amazing report brought by the child, quote, the little boy lied, end quote, more or less. There is no limit to the number of hypotheses which may be suggested to account for any body of alleged facts except the limits of the fertility of the imagination, and there are no final grounds of discrimination between the several hypotheses proposed. More than one will account for the facts on the assumption that it is true, and each man becomes enamored of his own hypothesis and twists the facts to make them accord with it. We soon find ourselves in the midst not merely of a confused mass of hypotheses, but also of a confused mass of doubted facts, and we seek in vain for a firm footing. Everything, however, is different if we approach a body of truths presented for our acceptance with presuppositions rather than hypotheses in our hands. Presuppositions are solid things on which we can take our stand. We already believe, say, in God and in a personal God and miserable world for its salvation. We bring these things with us as facts of which we are assured, not as hypotheses which we are testing, and what a different aspect is taken on by the body of Christian doctrine. Now, everything is clear and sure and solid, and the difference hangs, says Mr. Knox in effect, wholly on the difference in standpoint. Mr. Knox, it will be seen, is an, quote, authoritarian, end quote, and that is well. We cannot get along in this world of fact without authority. Without authority we may assure ourselves, it may be, of what must be. We cannot be assured of a single thing that merely is, and Christianity as a historical religion is a religion of facts, and is therefore built up, in all that makes it that specific religion which we call Christianity, on authority. We may be theists without authority, but not Christians. The blows which Mr. Knox strikes in the name of authority are without doubt fatal, and he does especially good service when he exposes the inconsequence of the attempt to substitute religious experience for authority as the foundation of conviction. Quote, "As a matter of modernist psychology," he writes, "this appeal to experience is very interesting. The modernist will not allow himself to be regarded as in any way prejudiced in favor of one particular theological system. He therefore collects together the testimony of innumerable other people, principally bishops, medieval nuns, and contemporary coal-burners, who were and are, beyond any shadow of dispute, prejudiced theologians, prejudiced by what they believed upon a basis of purely traditional authority, and the result of this appeal is summed up, as if it were the most modern of all critical investigations, an essay in psychology. But if a priori assumptions are to play no part in modern theology, spiritual experience must play no part in modern theology, for spiritual experience is based on a priori assumptions," end quote, pages 193 to 194. Quote, "The whole argument from experience," he comments, "seems to rest on the assumption that you can first make people believe, on the strength of Bible documents or inherited tradition, certain clearly defined dogmas, and then, when they have got accustomed to this way of thinking, you can come and knock away the supports on which the belief rests, biblical and traditional, and say, we have now proved the truth of these doctrines because we have reared on them so splendid an edifice of faith," end quote, page 190. Valid, however, as is Mr. Knox's appeal to authority, and sound as is his contention that authority lies at the basis of all Christian faith, it must be confessed that he gives no adequate account either of the ground or the nature of the authority to which he makes appeal. His argument thus hangs in the air, and the impression is created that the authority on which Christianity rests is accepted by its votaries by a purely arbitrary act of will. This is indeed, to all appearance, true in Mr. Knox's own case, otherwise we surely would catch in his numerous allusions to it some hint of a rational basis of his acceptance of authority. He is, it would seem, just a, quote, traditional, end quote, Christian, and is inclined to give validity to the traditional Christianity which he accepts, chiefly, one would imagine, despite his solid refutation of that ground of faith, because of the beneficent results of his acceptance of it. He would scarcely expect us to take literally, quote, the crude metaphor, end quote, by which he attempts to illustrate his attitude to Scripture and tradition, page 33, quote, "You have a motor car with two headlights, each throwing out its rays obliquely in either direction. The hedge on each side is illuminated by one lamp only, but in the center of the road the two lights converge, and mark out a triangular area of brilliant clearness. The two lights of Scripture and tradition, if we may pursue this crude metaphor, may be said in the same way to provide sufficient guidance for our course only when they overlap. Beyond this area, speculation is at liberty to botanize in the hedgerows." End quote. If we were really to, quote, pursue this crude metaphor, end quote, Mr. Knox would have left himself no authority at all, if neither scripture nor tradition has any authority by itself, and he apparently deprives each severally of authority. They cannot have any authority when combined, on the principle at least in which Mr. Knox tells us he was brought up, page 190, viz. That 0 plus 0 yields still 0. Authority is not a thing of degrees. It is either absolute or non-existent. He must therefore look upon either scripture or tradition as by itself authoritative, if their combination is to be authoritative. And it is quite clear that it is to tradition, not to scripture, that Mr. Knox really accords authority. When he says, therefore, quote, "It is only at the point where scripture and ecclesiastical tradition combine to form a defined doctrine, that he who thinks with Mr. Knox, pretends to stand on sure ground in virtue of a presupposition," end quote, page 33. We can but understand him to mean that his faith rests not on scripture simpliciter, but on scripture as interpreted by tradition, that is to say, that he finds his authority not in scripture at all, but in tradition. In other words, that he is a traditionalist in the sense of the Church of Rome. Authority to him thus spells tradition, and tradition spells church, and church spells practically Rome. Mr. Knox, in a word, is a high Anglican, indistinguishable in his theory of authority from the general doctrine on this subject of the Roman Church, except perhaps for a little drawing back when the place of the Pope in the definition of dogma comes into consideration. Compare page 193. His pleading for a commanding place for authority in religion is largely vitiated, therefore, by the circumstance that his own view of the nature, seat, and ground of authority in religion is baseless and untenable. This fundamental inconsequence in his own point of view does not prevent Mr. Knox, however, from exposing the inconsequences of the modernist point of view, as illustrated in the authors of Foundations, in a very trenchant manner. In successive chapters he traverses the greater number of the essays in Foundations, and points out in them tendencies of method and treatment which annul their conclusions. He speaks himself of having dealt only very cursorily with Mr. Moberly's essay on the Atonement, but we are not sure that the strictures on this essay do not constitute the best piece of criticism in the volume. The notion that our Lord offered for us a, quote, vicarious penitence, end quote, is very properly scored. Can there be such a thing as, quote, vicarious penitence, end quote? If there can be, can it take away sin? And if it can take away sin, must it not be because it, as suffering, is, quote, actually allowed to count in the eye of divine justice as satisfaction for sins which we have committed, end quote? And if this is so, how does it avoid the criticism that, quote, it is immoral that the sufferings of one man should be accepted as satisfaction for the sins of another, end quote? The essence of the matter is touched in a passage like the following, quote, but this surely is clear, that if we are to hold the full traditional view of the atonement, we must suppose that the brand left by our sins is not twofold but threefold. They leave a mark on our own souls, true. They leave a mark on the lives of the men around us, true. But over and above all this, they leave a mark in the book of life, a black mark on our records which no human penitence can efface. There is an objective disturbance in the moral order which our sins have created, and only one thing could right it, the sacrifice of Christ, to which we have contributed not a jot or a tittle in our own part. There can be neither Catholicism nor evangelicalism where this fact is not realized, end quote, page 171. Some of the remarks on the deity of our Lord and the Incarnation are equally pungent, and that whether the attempt to substitute the category of will for that of substance in construing the one doctrine, or the notion of kenosis in construing the other, is under discussion. To be of the same mind with one another is not to have numerically only one mind among us, and when two beings will the same thing, it is not clear that they are therefore but one. And if anything such as the Canonists assert happened at the Incarnation, we certainly cannot say that Jesus was God, but only that he was a man who once had been God. The virgin birth and the empty tomb, though Mr. Knox stumbles sadly with reference to our Lord's resurrection body, and the ascension are dealt with in adequate fashion. Mr. Knox is willing even to become aggressive here. Quote, Mr. Streeter says he knows of no living theologian who would maintain a physical ascension in this crude form. I have no claim to be a theologian. I can only say that, as a person of ordinary education, I believe, as I hope for salvation, in this literal doctrine. I believe that whatever change may have glorified the risen body, when it passed beyond the cloud into a new mode or sphere of existence, the earth has ever since the ascension been lighter by so many pounds weight, and the sum of matter in the world, the less by so many cubic inches of volume," end quote, page 85. Such materialism may shock some ears, but the issue ultimately comes to just that. There are, of course, other passages with which we feel less satisfaction. We do not go quite with Mr. Knox in his dealing with miracles, especially in his inability to separate between biblical and ecclesiastical miracles. We certainly do not go with him in his treatment of Scripture, especially in his discussion of the eschatological utterances of our Lord. His Romeward tendencies, which are numerous and decisive, are an offence to us. His obsession with freedom is equally regrettable. Even here, however, he shows his characteristic courage and, in the interests of free will, cheerfully denies that we have any solid ground for anticipating the conversion of the world. Enough, there is much in Mr. Knox's book which is crude and unconsidered, but this cannot destroy its general value as an exposure of the weaknesses of modernism, and it is in this that its significance lies. It is an earnest and successful plea to reasonable men to draw back from these shifting shoals where, quote, "we have to be reassured by a yearly statement from Dr. Sanday, comparable to the weather report, as to what we may still believe," end quote, and to plant our feet firmly on the rock. The fine air of conviction which suffuses it, and the brightness of the style, should give the book a wide circulation, and we trust will give it, in its main message, large acceptance. End of Review of Some Loose Stones by B.B. Warfield. Review of A Dictionary of the Bible by B.B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dictionary of the Bible, dealing with its language, literature, and contents, including the biblical theology, edited by James Hastings, M.A., D.D., with the assistance of John A. Selby, M.A., and chiefly in the revision of the proofs of A.B. Davidson, D.D., LL.D., Professor of Hebrew, New College, Edinburgh, S.R. Driver, D.D., Lit. D., Regius Professor of Hebrew, Oxford, and H.B. Sweet, D.D., Lit. D., Regius Professor of Divinity, Cambridge, Volume 1, A. to Feasts, New York, Charles Scribner's Sons, Edinburgh, T&T Clark, 1898. Quarto, pages 15 to 864. The first volume of Dr. William Smith's Dictionary of the Bible was published at the end of 1863 and was reissued in America 4 years later in a thoroughly revised form under the editorial care of Dr. H.B. Hackett and Mr. Ezra Abbott. Before the close of the year 1870, the 4 volumes of the American edition were in the hands of the public. Of course, there were other works of the kind in the field, the most valuable of which were probably Dr. Patrick Fairbairn's The Imperial Bible Dictionary, 2 volumes, Royal Octavo, London, 1866, and Dr. W. Lindsay Alexander's edition of Kitto's Cyclopedia of Biblical Literature, 3 volumes, Royal Octavo, Philadelphia, 1866. McClintock and Strong's Cyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature, the publication of which was begun in 1867, sought to occupy so much wider a field that it hardly came into direct competition with the specific Bible dictionaries. It is true to say, at all events, that the American Smith immediately took its place on the tables of scholarly American ministers and students of the Word as the standard work of the kind. That place it has worthily and almost undisputedly held ever since. Meanwhile, a generation of years has passed, and in these days of restless research, a generation is a very long time, in which many changes of opinion must needs occur, and some not inconsiderable advance in knowledge may haply be made. It is easy, to be sure, to overestimate the increase of knowledge that has come with the process of the years. Augustine points out that all the knowledge best worth having is acquired by the human animal in its infancy. It is the puling metaphysician who accomplishes the task set us by the oracle and learns to know himself, and wiser than he may afterward become, separates off from himself the external world and discovers about him other spirits like himself. It is in our earliest youth that we learn to think and speak and read, and what are all other acquisitions but relatively unimportant growths on these fruitful roots? Similarly, what is best worth knowing about the Bible has not been reserved for the aging church of the last third of the 19th century to discover. It is all duly set down in our Smith and Kitto and Fairbairn, and in our Calmet too, and in whatever before that served to inform men what the Bible is, what it contains, and what one must know in order to understand and appreciate its message. Whatever else the last 30 years have discovered, they have not discovered the Bible, nor anything about the Bible of the first importance. Nevertheless, the diligent labours of Bible students during this period have not been in vain. A considerable body of fresh information has been accumulated, sometimes of a corrective, sometimes of a supplementary character. The time has fully come to garner this new material and put it within the reach of all. The most natural way of doing this was to build on the old foundations, and we were accordingly promised a revised edition of Smith. After the publication of its first instalment, however, that project seems to have fallen through. In its stead, we have been bidden to look for 2 completely new Bible dictionaries. The one of these, projected first by Professor W. Robertson Smith, is being completed under the editorship of Professor T. K. Chain, with the assistance of Dr. J. Sutherland Black, and its first part is announced to appear in the approaching October. It is expected to occupy what is known as a very advanced standpoint, to scorn, quote, average opinion, end quote, and start out from, quote, the latest that has been written, end quote, on each subject, and to apply the, quote, most exact scientific methods, end quote, and thoroughgoing critical solvents to all that is biblical. The other of our 2 promised dictionaries, undertaken by the great firm of Messrs. T&T Clark of Edinburgh, was understood to be laid out on less extreme lines and to aim at presenting rather what is known about the Bible than the latest conjectures concerning it by the least sober of scholars. It has outstripped its rival in speed of preparation, and its first volume now lies before us. Those who had looked forward to it, however, as throughout a reliable guide to what is really known of biblical matters, will be in some measure disappointed. The editor speaks of the care that has been exercised to exclude, quote, unaccepted idiosyncrasies, end quote, from its pages. The success of the effort has been only partial. The trouble has been in the standard assumed. Unaccepted is a good word, but its value can be estimated only when we ask further, by whom? Unaccepted by a narrow circle of critical scholars, which has acquired temporary vogue among us, has been the practical answer. And the consequences are that the sober reader finds the book characterized by the abundance of idiosyncrasies which crowd its pages, and is offended by its apparent lack of coherence as a whole, and that the distinction between the 2 new Bible dictionaries sinks at last very much into a question of details. The interval that separates the 2 is indeed just the interval that divides from one another the 2 Oxford colleagues, Drs. Chain and Driver. There is no need to minimize this interval, it is perceptible, but there is no difference in principle between the 2, it is only a matter of a little more or a little less. The Edinburgh Dictionary both profits and loses by the difference. It loses by it in internal consistency and unity, and in stability and hold upon the future, for after all the, quote, moderate criticism, end quote, which it has elected to represent, wavers between 2 opinions, and must advance in one direction or the other through rapid change. While for an extremer skepticism there is always a constituency, few perhaps, but fit, it being true in this sphere too that, poor, we have always with us. It profits by it, insomuch as the frying pan, after all is said, is a better place than the fire, and insomuch as the essentially mediating and inconsistent character of the standpoint of moderate criticism, which it assumes, has naturally justified the insertion of many articles of a more conservative tendency, although these are mostly on the safe topics, i.e. on such subjects as impinge only indirectly on matters of criticism, and especially has demanded a tolerably conservative attitude in matters connected with the New Testament. Despite its unsatisfactory critical point of view, accordingly, this new dictionary is not only a rich record of, but also an important contribution to our present knowledge of the Bible. It has been edited with the highest skill and gathers in the most scholarly manner the results of modern research into biblical matters. It is full, thorough, learned, and bids fair to be the student's vade mecum for the next few years. From the bookmaker's point of view, the new dictionary has been modelled on Chambers' Encyclopedia, and its page is a very close reproduction of that work. Perhaps the impression of the type is a little less clear, and certainly it falls short of Chambers in the matter of illustrations. Here indeed is the weakest point of the new dictionary from a formal point of view. The illustrations are very few. Only some 44 separate figures occur in this whole volume, and only 2 articles, agriculture and dress, can be called illustrated at all, and also, we fear we must add, very poor. The preface tells us that, quote, the illustrations are confined to subjects which cannot be easily understood without their aid, end quote. We should never have discovered for ourselves that this was the principle that governed their occurrence. Could we not then have spared the odd ink splotch which is labelled, quote, a lodge in a garden of cucumbers, end quote, page 532. We could not, on the same ground perhaps, ask to be relieved from the, quote, cedar from the Basheri Grove, end quote, page 364, but we have our doubts whether it illustrates anything. This cedar of Lebanon and the porcupine, page 304, are the only natural history subjects that are figured. In our judgment, every animal and plant mentioned in the Bible should have been presented to the eye. In the matter of illustrations, the new dictionary falls lamentably not only behind what was expected of it, but also behind its predecessors. The strength of the volume lies in what we may speak of as the scholarly character of its contents. Here we are specially struck with the admirable quality of the numerous short articles, particularly those on the obsolete and obsolescent words of the English versions, which are mostly written by the editor and leave nothing to be desired. The proper names of the Bible are very thoroughly worked out, and a special word of commendation is due to the geographical terms. The same is to be said of the ethnological, geological, and natural history articles, the last of which, forming a very notable series of some 60 articles, we are proud to say are from the pen of an American scholar, Dr. George E. Post, professor in the American College at Bayreuth. Along with Dr. Post, some 13 other American writers appear in this volume. Of these, Dr. Willis J. Beecher has contributed the largest number of articles, which seems to be partly due to his having undertaken the article Giant to appear in the next volume with all subsidiary titles. We have from him at any rate the following 12 articles: Anak, Abba, Ava, Beth Dagon, Dagon, Delilah, Drunkenness, Dwarf, Ekron, Emerods, Emim, Ephes, Dam Ruim. Needless to say, these are thoroughly satisfactory. The most extended one, that on drunkenness, being a useful historical study of a rather neglected subject. Dr. Ira M. Price contributes 7 articles: Abrek, Akkad, Assurbanipal, Baeth, Belshazzar, Chaldea, Evil Merodach, chiefly, as will be seen, on subjects connected with Assyriological learning. 4 articles come from the hand of Professor J. H. Thayer: Abba, Ba, Eli, Lama Sabachthani, and Ephatha, all of which concern the Aramaic element in the New Testament. 3 each are contributed by Professors F. C. Porter, E. L. Curtis, G. T. Purvis, and H. Porter. Professor Frank C. Porter's contribution consists of the extended and valuable article Apocrypha, along with short accompanying notes on Achior and Kilod. Professor Curtis's of the important article on the chronology of the Old Testament and Daniel, Man and Book, all written from the standpoint of the presently fashionable skeptical criticism, the historical character of the Book of Daniel being denied, and indeed even the historical existence of a Daniel left in doubt. Professor H. Porter writes about cupbearer, distaff, and dying, and Professor Purvis most satisfactorily on crown, diadem, and darkness. 2 articles each are contributed by Professors W. A. Brown, Cross, Excommunication, B. B. Warfield, Doubt, Faith, and Lewis W. Batten, Ezra and Ezra Nehemiah, from the standpoint of the skeptical criticism. Dr. Sela Merrill contributes a short note on Chorazin, Professor J. Poucher a long account of crimes and punishments, and Professor Francis Brown a long article on Chronicles, in which, with great minuteness, he gathers together all that can tend to break down confidence in the historical trustworthiness of the books, his general conclusion being that, quote, it is plain that the character of the chronicler's testimony, when we can control it by parallel accounts, is not such as to give us reason to depend on it with security when it stands alone, end quote. In all, the American contribution to the dictionary consists of some 104 articles. It is not such as to render the book an international book, but in point of scholarship it is a creditable aid to a British enterprise, and to it is due some of the longest and most important articles in the volume, such as those on Apocrypha, 13 pages, Chronology of Old Testament, 6 pages, Chronicles, 8 pages, Crimes and Punishments, 7 pages, Daniel, 6 pages, Faith, 12 pages. Perhaps we can scarcely speak of it as fairly representative of American scholarship. American Old Testament scholarship, for example, is not only prevailingly but overwhelmingly conservative, or as it would be better called, historical, while the adherents of the school of skeptical criticism are here thrown prominently forward. Nevertheless, from the standpoint of the dictionary, it cannot be said that American aid has been despised, and certainly the American contribution does not in quality fall below the general standard of the work. Fullness and thoroughness being among the objects which the editor has set before himself, quite a number of the articles have been allowed, quote, to extend to a considerable length, end quote. We have counted some 75 which extend to a length exceeding 2 pages, that is to say about 3,000 words each. One article, Mr. C.H. Turner's comprehensive paper on the chronology of the New Testament, attains the dimensions of a treatise, filling 22 of these large pages. 2 others exceed 15 pages each, viz. Professor Hommel's noted paper on Babylonia and Mr. Crumb's perhaps equally notable paper on Egypt. Professor Hommel's paper on Assyria almost equals in length and quite equals in value the paper on Babylonia. Other papers exceeding 10 pages are Mr. Headlam's careful survey of the Book of Acts, 10 pages, Professor Porter's article on the Apocrypha, 13 pages, Professor Stewart's article on Bible, 13 pages, Mr. Gayford's article on Church, 15 pages, Mr. White's article on David, 13 pages, Mr. Strong's admirable paper on Ethics, 12 pages, and Professor Warfield's paper on Faith, 12 pages. Some 11 more papers exceed 7 pages, Dr. Plummer's Baptism, Professor Francis Brown's Chronicles, Mr. Kilpatrick's Conscience, Principal Robertson's 2 Corinthians, his 1 Corinthians falls just short of 7 pages, Professor Pouch's Crimes and Punishments, Professor Ryle's Deuteronomy, Professor Locke's Ephesians, Professor Davidson's Eschatology of the Old Testament, Mr. Charles's Eschatology of the Apocrypha, Professor Salmon's Eschatology of the New Testament, Mr. Thackeray's Books of Exodus, and Professor Bernard's Fall. 15 others exceed 5 pages, viz. Professor Mayer's Brethren of the Lord, Professor Curtis's Chronology of the Old Testament, Principal Robertson's 1 Corinthians, Principal Whitehouse's Cosmogony, Professor Davidson's Covenant, Professor Curtis's Book of Daniel, Mr. Mackey's Dress, Professor Peake's Ecclesiastes, Professor Kennedy's Education, Mr. Forbes Robinson's Egyptian Versions, Mr. Strachan's Elijah, Mr. Hartford Battersby's Book of Exodus, Professor Skinner's Ezekiel, and Principal Harding's Feasts and Fasts. It will not fail to be observed how many of the titles thus incidentally mentioned concern matters of biblical theology. The effort to give proper treatment to these subjects forms one of the special features of this dictionary. We have noted in the volume such articles as the following which fall under this head: Adoption, J.S. Candlish, 1 1/2 pages; Angel, A.B. Davidson, 4 pages; Anger, Wrath of God, J. Orr, 1 page; Ascension, J. Denny, 2 pages; Assurance, A. Stewart, 1/4 page; Atonement, J. O. F. Murray, 1 1/2 pages; Baptism, A. Plummer, 6 pages; Blessedness, W. F. Adeny, 1/2 page; Brotherly Love, J. Denny, 1/2 page; Calling, J. Macpherson, 1/5 page; Chastening, J. Denny, 3/4 page; Christology, J. Agar Beat, 3 pages; Church, S. C. Gayford, 15 pages; Communion, J. A. Robertson, 2 pages; Conscience, T. B. Kilpatrick, 7 1/2 pages; Conversion, J. S. Banks, 1/2 page; Corruption, J. Massey, 1/3 page; Cosmogony, Owen C. Whitehouse, 6 pages; Covenant, A. B. Davidson, 6 pages; Creed, J. Denny, 1 page; Curse, J. Denny, 1 1/2 pages; Demon, Devil, Owen C. Whitehouse, 4 1/2 pages; Election, J. O. F. Murray, 4 pages; Eschatology, Old Testament, A. B. Davidson, 6 pages; Apocrypha, R. H. Charles, 8 pages; New Testament, S. D. F. Salmon, 7 pages; Ethics, T. B. Short, 12 pages; Faith, B. B. Warfield, 12 pages; Fall, J. H. Bernard, 7 pages; Fasting, V. H. Stanton, 1 2/3 pages; Fear, W. O. Burroughs, 1/2 page. Many of these articles are admirable, all of them are carefully written, some of them are adequate. but they certainly are not consentient, and our pity follows the man who seeks to learn what the teaching of the Bible is by reading consecutively these topics in the dictionary. The individualistic and idiosyncratic character of the volume comes out here no more strongly than elsewhere, but it is disturbingly present here as elsewhere, and it makes the reader wonder what the editor can mean by speaking of the book as a whole as, quote, reliable and authoritative, end quote. If Dr. Orr is reliable and authoritative on the wrath of God, for example, as he certainly is, then Dr. Murray cannot possibly be reliable and authoritative on the atonement, for he leaves no place for wrath in God. And if we rise beyond the question of mere harmony among the several writers, and ask after some general standard of doctrinal truth which has governed the admission of views, we shall ask in vain. All sorts of theological conceptions here struggle together and label themselves alike biblical. We can only say that, as in criticism, the standard of the book is mainly what can only be described as skeptical. In theology, it is mainly Socinianizing, though both terms must be taken here, of course, not in their precise but in their broader connotations. It cannot be said either that the space allowed for the treatment of the topics under the rubrics of biblical theology is at all nicely proportioned to their relative importance. Surely, in many cases, for example, the space allotted to the topics of atonement and baptism is not adjusted to the relative importance of the subjects. Nor indeed is the list of topics treated as complete as it might well be. We miss, for instance, any proper discussion of such topics as creation and fatherhood. The cross-references given in neither case fill the need, and we miss altogether such entries as absolution, age, the present and to come, apokatasis, apostasy, asceticism, bearing sin, benediction, Beelzebub, birth, new, blood of Christ, ceremonial, communion, conception, miraculous, consummation, descent to hell, end, other than the mere term, eternity, exaltation, example. In the interests of fullness and accessibility, such topics should not be passed over. We have set down frankly the impression the New Bible Dictionary has made on us at first sight. Space would fail us to undertake detailed criticism of the separate articles. Its characteristic mark seems to be accuracy, and it is obviously a book which has information to give with a lavish hand. The student will seldom consult it in vain, though he may sometimes refuse its leading. He will be always stimulated and instructed by its presentation. It is a book, moreover, which will beyond doubt improve with acquaintance. We congratulate the editors and publishers alike on the successful launching of so great an enterprise. End of Review of Dictionary of the Bible by B.B. Warfield.